Hello and welcome to Every Trivial Fact. Today's topic is education and what has been called an education and teachers crisis here in America, and as far as I can tell, the West at large. They're having trouble retaining teachers all across the English-speaking world, and there's a lot of problems related to both the administration aspect of it, the policy aspect of it, and then here in America, it's the people themselves and their attitudes in a lot of ways. But before I get too deep into it, I'd like to introduce my friend and guest, Trish. She's teacher therapy on YouTube. She talks a lot about, well, this educational and I guess what a lot of teachers have called a crisis of society. Hi, Trish. How you doing?
Hi, I'm great. Thanks so much for having me today.
Oh, yeah. No, thanks for joining. Glad you're here.
Definitely.
To begin, do you want to just kind of give a little bit of background with your with education? And I don't know if you want to start with your education or.
Sure. Yeah, so I am kind of an accidental teacher candidate. I studied youth ministry and got a degree in that field in 2012. And I ended up by chance joining Teach for America in 2013. And that's basically a program where they choose from people that have bachelor's degrees in different fields. And they essentially give them a 5-week boot camp and then throw us in the classroom. It's normally in inner city context where there's high needs areas. And so I ended up teaching for about 8 years. I taught in public, private, and charter schools. And I just really kind of became disillusioned with the education system. I worked at 5 different schools. And as I'm sure we'll get into later in the chat, I just really found that school had changed so much, even from when I was a student, and essentially everything that I wanted to do as a teacher, which is, what you would think, educating students, helping them to become citizens that, had values and morals and virtues. I had my path blocked at every turn, and it just turned into a giant frustration that I thought I could fix by switching schools.
Well,
schools.
Can I ask you a question on that real quick?
Yeah, totally.
What popped into my head is it just bad for the current business model? It just seems like ethics and values do not fit into modern, I don't know, consumptive American lifestyle, including our government education system.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. And I think as a society,
you talked a lot about it. Yeah.
Yeah, we can't agree on what we value. So one person will say, okay, I value hard work and dedication. And then another person will say, well, that's not really fair to those who have been oppressed and traumatized. We need to focus on that. And so then people want to focus on,
that's just on the oppressed and traumatized. It's like, yeah, the historically oppressed and traumatized, it's like they're forever in that position. And I don't know if that means you're forever supposed to look at those people like victims or cripples, but that seems to be the message to me. And then they're always, right, there's no overcoming. You're just always in that position.
Absolutely. And I feel like it really sets up, sort of the handout society that a lot of people have brought up, this idea that people are perpetually traumatized victims that are incapable of meeting standards, excelling and achieving in life. Therefore, they need the state or the government or, virtuous missionary types in education to save them. And you're right, it becomes this vicious cycle of people that are stuck in the same situation. And
in the same mindsets too, I'd say. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And to me, not a lot of people know this about me, but I actually came from a really rough background that did include a lot of trauma and a lot of, generational trauma and even poverty. There's a lot of addiction on both sides of my family. And so by this current system, I should have never gotten a master's degree. I shouldn't have any degree of success. But the thing that ironically really, really was so helpful for me was learning to read at a really young age and just devouring and consuming books. And that's what I did all the time, all throughout my adolescence, even in the midst of a really broken, traumatic home situation filled with addiction and violence. I would go into my room and I would read for hours and hours and hours. And it really transformed my view of the world and my thinking and my perception of what was possible for me. And that's why I was so passionate when I heard of Teach for America, like, oh, great, I can help inner city underserved kids that, a lot of times are students and people of color to have what I got to have. And essentially I was blocked at every turn and kind of told, no, you can't have standards for them. No, that's too difficult for them. No, you can't read that novel because it doesn't have characters that look like them. And essentially it was just, as my favorite phrase is, an Orwellian nightmare. It's just like I was being told basically
Yeah,
that
that's what got my attention, by the way, listening to checking out your stuff, because I'll put this out there. I put together this audio compilation of what was it called, the American or Western Education Blowout Special, something like that. And the point is, it was a study of all these different teachers. Like when you have hundreds and thousands of teachers and admin and everyone calling it, again, a societal crisis. And then out of everyone, you were the one, you used a few stark phrases like an Orwellian nightmare. And you also said things like you couldn't be honest. And you also said there's a lie culture around teaching, which I definitely want to, we get in a little bit more there. I don't want to derail you too much from our current position.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's one of those things, there's like that cognitive dissonance. It's like, okay,
Yes.
I know my
Yes.
values, I know what I believe, I know what I have lived to be
Right.
true, and yet I'm being told that these students basically shouldn't have law and order of any sort, not in school and not in society. I'm being taught that these students are incapable of learning, ironically in the place where we're supposed to educate students. And so it just was a
Oh,
disaster.
no. And this is where, it pulls at my heart, because I don't know. I was going to say, are you from the ghetto and or the trailer park too? Because you talked about how reading changed your perception growing up. And it was so important because in those situations, I could tell you, like, I could never fully understand it on my own. And no one could ever fully explain it to me. And in retrospect, I look back and it felt like growing up after a bomb went off or something. It felt like being raised, like in certain respects, it's like being in a bomb crater, and then you can't see beyond the lip of it, and no one else can articulate to you the how or the why.
Yeah,
And then
absolutely.
only through better understand, well, I mentioned to you this earlier, but the whole point of education, I can't help but think of what Frederick Douglass says. It's to make men unfit for slavery. That's the point of it. And then if your education system is the exact opposite in instilling what, in psychological terms is called learned helplessness, right?
Yeah.
Dependence, codependent, just either way, it seems and looks and sounds like a dysfunctional message, a dysfunctional relationship. And in that education special, and in your and I know in your work and all these other teacher works, a lot of the focus is on this common American dysfunction, the, I don't know, the amount of just families that are in crisis and kids that are in crisis.
Yeah.
You just said recently on a podcast you did with Mr. Nico Summer Schooling, I think is his channel's name, but his name's Nico, right? And you guys were talking about this, again, I guess back to the society crisis and the crisis with the kids. And then that you say you can see the discrepancy between your experience and, sure, I guess if we're being realistic and fatalistic in a wise manner, we could say, yeah, not everyone has an inspiring story. Not everyone has a happy ending, right? There's technically no one's promised anything. Technically, there's no contingencies, right? So then why, if that's already the case, why would you do what's in your power to hold people back or to feed them this kind of cultish message of just helplessness? And I guess I'll say this and I'll hand it back over to you. But when I kind of boil that down, that kind of that helplessness is that whatever they're doing, they're not only not educating the children and the people on our American history and the back and the forth, the good and the bad, especially in comparison to the larger world and historical context dating back thousands of years in the history of civilization. So they're not only failing in these basic things, but they're also failing to teach them anything modern and new. And I think in a fundamental sense, to what I mean is to compete in this modern world where these technological revolutions are going to increasingly render down our system into, once again, if our values and ethics are already incompatible with the general system itself, and I mean of consumption of our education systems, of our government systems, of capitalism, for people who have valid and intelligent criticisms, let's say, because the whole basic notion of it's bad or burn it down, it's like, no, that's not adequate, right? That's not a real observation. That doesn't help anyone. So just that's what's disturbing about it. Going, if we already have a bunch of people saying they're miserable and they're poor, and we already have these problems and they're already poorly educated through this existing system, then what's it going to look like with more and more generations that stack up of helpless people who are taught helplessness and who are not taught, again, how to compete or how to learn. They're not given all those words to articulate and understand either their own experience or anyone else's. It's like, and that reminds me of the fundamental nature of the disconnected, alienated society. And I guess this is a lot of postmodern and kind of left-wing critique of capitalism, right? That this is what it does. Like, you have, what do you call it? The one-dimensional man. And, I can even think of like something like The Invisible Man by Ellison, let's say, where he was thinking beyond race even, right? He was saying that, I'm just invisible as a man. It's, you don't see color, you don't see a man. And I don't see how this problem doesn't keep compounding in the fragmentation, like you mentioned it earlier. Sorry, I've been going on for a minute here. But like, yeah, there has been that fragmentation where, and I wanted to point this out earlier, where there is no real we, back to the society crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there is so much black and white thinking, no pun intended, but
Sure.
It's just this idea that nuance is missing from the conversation. And for example, with the topic of empathy versus accountability, it's like people can't conceive of the fact that we need both. And I think that it's common for societies to have pendulum swings. So I
Right.
definitely understand that maybe in the 1950s, maybe there was a lot of really harsh discipline. Kids were humiliated. Maybe people did roll with an iron fist and kids were obedient out of a sense of fear.
That's so long ago, at this point.
And so we've swung all the way to the other side where kids can't even feel a little bit of remorse because that's considered abusive. Kids can't feel a little bit of embarrassment. And there is such thing as healthy embarrassment.
See, are we trying to? And then I can't help but ask, like, okay, do you want kind of little sociopaths? Because this was a lot of the teachers' criticisms going like, hey, we're actually, for all this talk of value and morals and ethics, trying to be good people, that we're actually failing to do that. And if you don't actually teach them, then kids will take advantage of that just like anyone else,
Oh, yes.
We're not just, peachy keen by nature, right? We're not.
Yeah. That's the heart of it. And that's what's so difficult, because it was really shocking to me that adults working with children, it's like, do you forget how children are by nature? I'm not trying to be controversial, but they lie. They're selfish. They're, a little bit self-absorbed. That's the nature of childhood. And ideally, you'd have a loving adult that teaches children to share, that teaches children that honesty is a virtue, that teaches children not to be lazy. And
right.
Well,
I mean, we have to, though. We like to operate in a complex world like this, we need a high degree of both cooperative and competitive sophistication.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with technology, only ever more so. And this is, I also wanted to get your opinion on this, like with the way the education policy and funding has gone over the last few decades. Policies, a lot of them are regarded as failures, like No Child Left Behind. And I can't help but look at that and go, from a pragmatic utilitarian government perspective, did they just see the education system as pointless or a failure, or that, the consumption class doesn't need to have an education and they just kind of kneecapped it with these kind of policies? It just seems like, as education has slid downwards and backwards, as much as we've talked so far, we haven't even scratched the surface, because there's the way the teachers run the classroom, or the way that they're technically not allowed to run the classroom. There's the relationships between admin and coworkers. There's the relationships between the students, parents, and teachers, and just the way all this is playing out at the moment. I don't know. Do you want to speak to some of that, or should I just give a summary from some of the
I want to back up a little bit and kind of get to what I think the heart of the issue really is. And again, I feel like everything I say is controversial, so I can't not be controversial. But I really do.
Oh yeah, someone's watching and listening. Yeah. Someone's ready to jump down your throat or scream at you, or whatever it is. It's the nature of modern life, at least when it comes to the internet.
Yeah, but I'm going to be bold and kind of just tell you what I honestly think.
Sure,
I honestly think that as an American culture, at least at one point in our society, there were Judeo-Christian values. Whether somebody chooses to be Christian is, their own business, but we valued things like honor thy father and mother, honor authority. We valued hard work. We valued honesty, kindness, integrity, humility. There's just kind of values that go along with the Judeo-Christian worldview, even if the people in the society are not particularly Christian. Well, as the 60s, 70s, and 80s happened, all of those values got turned on their head. It was free sex, free drugs, rock and roll, live for yourself. We
but
only
at
have
least they had that. At least they had that. At least they had sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I feel bad for these current generations. It's all just anger and why. Like there's none of that.
Well, the
But
truth,
I mean, and I'm not saying that, you could say the degeneracy and the kind of, what do you call it, the hedonism of it. Because when I think back and look back at a lot of that stuff, like reading Ken Kesey's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Experiment, and you see this society at the pinnacle of its kind of wealth and luxury, and it's just so decadent, right? And these people are just indulging all their carnal desires because, I guess the problem of existence has been solved. Or so the mystical fallacy says, right? They assume like, oh, there's going to be a happy ending here. We're going to triumph over the forces of evil. And then nope, they became businessmen, and now we're where we're at. Keep going. Sorry.
It's a parable of addiction, really. I mean,
kind of, yeah.
The first Coke hit or whatever is fun until you're living under a and your kneecaps broken.
Oh, it's definitely a culture of addiction.
Yeah, that's what happens. And so I think, like they realize the whole sex, drugs, rock and roll, free love, anti-authority, no rules, live for today, that doesn't work. And so, maybe there was a mini pendulum swing back.
I think it's good for marketing, though. I think it works in marketing, but it's terrible in practice. It's like just bad for people. And then the fact that here's a bigger thing about it, I think you'd agree, is that it's not just the addiction and the consumption aspect of it. It's also that we treat people that way too.
Yeah.
And then even in the online space, it's like there's less decorum, and it's just kind of the nature. It's harsher. But then it begs questions of, well, all the miserable people spreading all the miserable things here. Like, what's up with these people? Where are they? What's wrong with them in their lives that they're even here in the first place, screaming at people, let's say.
Well, they hit the bottom of the well, and they found out there's no water in that lifestyle. Generationally, it's like, their parents were miserable, their families fell apart, people figured out, okay, I do have to pay bills, and just the family and basic morals and virtues at some point fell apart. And I totally get people's critique that the 50s weren't a golden era, because if I was living in the 50s, I'd probably be scrubbing toilets somewhere as a Black woman. So I totally get, there is like progress.
At least you wouldn't have to constantly qualify everything with as a Black woman, right? Quick, let me get out my papers. Don't hurt me.
As a funny side note, for one of my professional developments, it was called Courageous Conversations. We literally had to preface everything we said with like our intersectionality, like as a Black female.
See, that's what I mean.
Yeah,
right?
It's ridiculous. But for real, like, I get in the 50s that, it wasn't a perfect time, but we can see that, again, that lack of nuance, we couldn't have progress while keeping order, apparently, in some people's eyes.
Right.
They just thought we're going to tear the system down, just like we have, the BLM and the different Marxist movements today.
But I think that was a logical arc of even the morality itself, because of, it's not like the hippies had a different morality. They still took the, peace, love, right? Like it's still all inheritance from Christianity, and it's no different with the modern political parties. When I look at the biggest divide in the left-right paradigm here in America, it's what I see is that they both lay claim to a morality, and they both think they're superior to each other.
Well, they're missing the balance. I think it's so funny.
But I think we were headed here, I guess, is what I'm saying. Sorry to interrupt. It's like, I think this is the historical larger aspect of it, is that we were headed here. It was absolutely unavoidable, just like, well, when Europe kind of blew up, over the course of the last century, it was just kind of what happened there too. We had reached the expiration date on our organizational models and our belief models and our values model. And back to, I guess, if this is an age of atomization and disintegration and things coming apart, it's like, well, this is just where we're at. Things are coming apart, and it doesn't matter how much glue and policy and tape you use. It's coming apart, and there's no putting it back together. That's not to say it won't go on in some other incarnation, or a civilization collapses, let's say. And it's not like those people just disappear, right? They're still living there in the aftermath. and maybe they die, maybe they live, but it just changes, things go on. So
Yeah.
we're kind of at these critical turning points, and we saw that over the course of the last century, like you said, kind of culminating in the 60s.
Yeah.
And then like you said, I think because you were hitting at some of this with when you were talking about the values, and that with this coming apart and with the disintegration of values, the actual you set the idealism aside and you put on your, I don't know, your fatalist glasses, and you look around and you go, oh, this is like we're still accounting for the damage, and it's not even in yet. Like the real tab isn't in, the real cost isn't in, and even the damage schools do to children, let's say, that the cost for that isn't in yet. Going on to saying, okay, if we are instilling a certain learned helplessness in a lot of kids, we were kind of moving towards the heart of the matter. I'll let you take it
Yeah.
back over.
Yeah, definitely. Just the idea that without a cohesive set of values and without people from both sides of the aisle, whether you want to call it the left or the right, coming together with nuance and taking the best of both sides and working together and harmonizing a workable way forward, we have the situation that we have today. And so a lot of times on the right, we hear all about the accountability and the responsibility. On the left, we hear a lot about the empathy and the compassion, and both are great and both are needed, but the truth is that we need both.
Oh.
And so
It's two legs on the same cripple.
Mhm.
And if this two-legged man decides to cut off one of his legs, well, I think we know how the story goes. One-sided idealism is just always ruin. It's always its end
Yeah, a
game.
house divided against itself can't stand.
Yeah, and then maybe it pulls itself out, but it could be years or decades of problems and failures to culminate to that, and eventually the lies pile up enough. And I think that's part of our present reckoning too. A lot of these lies, and a lot of them do center around education and these kind of governmental systems and policies. And I actually had a scary thought there when you were mentioning about kind of that notion of, well, just it's a pluralism. Like if we can't agree to an ideal, and if we can't believe in an ideal, and if we can't meet anywhere there to occupy the same physical space as well as the same mental and emotional space, then I think that means it's impossible to actually work anything out.
Mhm.
And that's what makes me think, I guess I'll throw this out there, that I think we're in a civil war. And I've
Okay.
actually, I wrote about this. I've talked about it a little bit here and there, but I haven't done a video on it or anything, but I do think about it. And I do think that it's misunderstood, the conflict in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a clash of ideologies and a clash of worlds, essentially.
Yes,
But,
and
as we
values.
talked about,
And
if we can't have the conversation publicly, then there can't be resolution. We just have two sides screaming at each
it
other.
forces a lot of people underground. It increases the isolation, and it makes a lot of people further, you could say, physically, mentally, emotionally homeless. Because if there's an attack on the existing foundation and no agreement upon, well, what should the new foundation be, as if like we're going to have a year zero, right? You see that kind of thinking in like most idealists, right? This is where we find our final solution, right? This is where we're really going to fix things, or we have all the answers. And you see how arrogant and ignorant so many of these people are, and so many idealists are. Maybe that is, historically speaking, like that is the proverbial problem. There is a arrogance to it, and there's an insanity to it, right? Because it leads to pathology, in my opinion.
Definitely. And I think, too, the importance of family. We're really not allowed to say that in schools anymore, that parents matter, that they're important, that they are responsible for raising
They're not
children.
called parents anymore. They're called persons of raising children's welfare guardians.
I'm telling you, and it's just kind of scary. And I think here's if we want to go the non-conspiratorial route, I can go one of two ways, but we'll first
Sure.
give them the benefit of the doubt that some people, the powers that be, saw this impending collapse and saw, okay, kids are coming to school with less emotional regulation, they're coming to school with less skills, they're coming
Yes.
to school with a less of an interest in education. And I could probably say that happened even in my generation. I'll be 35 in September. Now, I lived in, the 90s and the 2000s with the school shooting.
Oh, it's a golden age.
Yeah.
Despite all that. And it's not, yeah, I think it's gone too. It's not coming back.
Yeah.
You're talking about the
And
changes between your time and now, right?
Yeah, definitely. But I feel like those seeds were
Technically
apparent,
our
and
time.
I was the early generation of, No Child Left Behind. I remember that coming out in elementary, and the really subtle shift, year after year to standardized testing. I'm from Texas. I remember being threatened, if you don't pass this test in fourth grade, you're not going on to the next grade level. And I remember the beginning of that. And I wonder if we're going the non-conspiratorial route first, if the powers that be saw, there's some major problems with the kids that are coming to school, and they wanted to try to maybe find a way to fix that. But I think even the way our
Oh, the
society is
results are in
going,
though, right? That it's been a failure, and
oh, a
that
disaster.
for and then quote unquote students of color and with the poor, they have the most abysmal results. Like it's from dropout rates to competency and literacy, math, you name it, right? That
Mhm.
they come out always the worst, and there's all this rhetoric
Yeah.
around it. Okay, but you're going on with the non-conspiratorial because I already immediately start heading towards the conspiratorial.
Yeah, the conspiratorial route is basically this is an
They meant
orchestrated
well.
collapse of, of society. And I also believe that too. I think it's a both end, but on the
Oh well,
non-conspiratorial,
yeah, yeah. No,
the
it's a
nice people in
controlled
the
burn.
pyramid that don't know, what the real agenda is on top, some of them genuinely thought, we can try to fix the situation. We can
Oh
try to
no.
fix these achievements.
Carlin was right. George Carlin was right. What are we gonna do? We're gonna lower the test scores. We're gonna lower the standards. We're gonna,
Yeah.
right? We're gonna
Well,
just
because the truth is that schools cannot fix what's broken.
no, they
When you
can't.
have a
Oh,
kid.
Nico talked about that. Nico, another teacher, right? Like you and him talked about that too,
Yeah,
right?
I think that's, I mean, maybe for who knows how many years, whoever the powers that be thought we can fix this, but they realized really fast we can't fix the problems that are going on in the home. We don't have that kind of authority. We can't provide, the kind of
Oh well,
discipline,
at least not
structure,
yet, huh?
yeah, and stability
but
and value.
but I was gonna say though that again the whole okay let me take it this way because I do think it is a control burn, and I think a lot of people are hip to that, not just the people you would call crazy conspiracy theorists or your flat earthers or your whatever. I mean just when you have people like your Klaus Schwabs and your Hararis and all
Mhm.
these politicians and newscasters, and they literally all say the same thing. And
Yeah.
you've listened to some of my stuff, so and it's just in the other. My favorite is from the other day. I think is it Joey Behar? I don't know. One of these empty talking heads was like, this other politician. He control people's thoughts, and that's our job. And the other guy's like, yeah, absolutely. And it's like, okay, thanks, mainstream
Oh
media.
wow.
Yeah, no, and it's like, they just say it. It's great. They don't even try and hide a lot of this stuff anymore. And
Yeah.
I think that's a good thing. But again, with the fragmentation problem, right? Your media is different from mine. Your what you view and understand is different from mine. And this has always been an issue of human distance and human communication because with an increasingly fragmented and alienated society, again, I guess, this kind of goes back to what happened even during COVID was that the studies are in on this too. And being isolated as social creatures, it's like for a lot of people, it vastly increases their stress and their aggression and their responses in their body and brains, plays out very poorly. And I think, like you said, they actually like the government realizes they can't fix that. But
Hmm.
what they can try and do is put a spin on what's happening and try and tell the people it's under control and try and take as much power as they can to maintain that regardless of what happens that they're justified in cracking down on people in what ways they can. And it doesn't matter how this stuff plays out because at any point in history it's always a matter of tyranny.
Hmm.
That's where we're at actually, and whether people can see it or not, it doesn't matter. And it's not a tyranny that's even, it's technically not left or right wing because it's the same, you have the same kind of people in there.
Yeah.
They're all invested in what they're invested in. Or
Hmm.
as Carlin would say, sooner or later the people in this country are going to realize the government does not care about you, does not care about your children, does not, and yeah, maybe like you said, there were some well-meaning people, but again, the results are in, and it's been an utter failure. And I told you that I think a lot of the screaming about race and gender and all these other things has been a scapegoat for the fact that the system and the education system, including its admin and teachers, that they all play their part, they all play their fault or have their faults, and to the degrees that they've all failed, that I think this is, my personal conspiracy theory that they're just trying to, again find a easy way out.
Yeah, and they want to cover their own tail, essentially. They want to say, oh, we did our part. We gave that child opportunities. They have a diploma now. We've
Yeah,
done
look, I wrote
everything
justice
we
on the
could do.
chalkboard.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it's, just like a band-aid for a bullet wound, essentially. It
Oh,
just,
and it's honestly, I'll say this real quick, just because, I'll talk to you about it because I know apparently you come from a similar place. To me, it's repugnant, to see a lot of the wealthiest, most educated, most kind of capricious middle managerial kind of classes, and from journalists to three-figure, what are they called, consultants, especially in education, to see all these people give lip service to this stuff, and they have no idea what it's like to come from the bottom of the American trash heap. They have no idea how that affects human physiology, the body, the brain, the mind. You know what I mean? They have no
absolutely.
friggin' clue. So at one point in time, I got a visceral reaction from people like that. I was just, if there's a worse kind of people, it's you.
Hmm.
You're scapegoating, you're blaming others. Like, if there is a human core of failure in all this, it is precisely this laziness and this hatred and this just utter stupidity and ignorance, like all the things that go in that make up our worst qualities. And I think with a lot of people, it's easy to think like, oh, it's 2022, we've evolved past our worst instincts, and if these other people are the problem and our opinions and our ideas are correct, then we've kind of come to our conclusions. And I guess this goes back to the point of the heart of the divide, is that it's not just that our values have expired, but that the different with the fragmentation problem and the wider splitting in its basic two temperaments, conservative and liberal, they've just come to different conclusions. It's not that, like, the debate's over. There's no debate to be had, right? There's no one's actually talking anymore. They haven't been talking for a long time. It's been a lot of screaming and yelling, and people have actually died, right? A lot of people have
Yeah.
died in the riots, in various fights. There's been both liberal and conservative leaning mentally ill people or terrorists or whatever you'd want to call them, where I don't necessarily take anyone's association with the political party, by the way. If someone commits political violence, it's like
Hmm.
I don't immediately go, oh, yep, that's the right, that's the left. It's like, no, dude, look at this person. They clearly had mental illness.
Yeah.
Sometimes that is the case. Like, this person's out of touch with reality. Like, he's talking to God, or he's talking to aliens, or he's imagining whatever utopia. But it's just absurd to me that we can't have honest conversations like any of this, or even like out here. I'll bring up these things so people who don't know have a better idea of the current American dishonesty and just the lies that are amounting. Like, one example is, in gun shootings, mass shootings now include like gang violence and just any kind of gun crime where more than one or two people are hurt. They've changed the definition to where it used to be a mass shooting was kind of understood to be this kind of terroristic kind of attack. It was that it's whether it's against the status quo or for something else, right? A lot of people, they have these motives and they write these manifestos, right? But again, nowadays they'll call, oh, look, a house party, someone pulled out a gun and shot a bunch of people and he was only aiming for one, and they'll call that a mass shooting. It's like, that is not the same as a nihilistic terror attack by someone who hates America, let's say, or who considers it a fake culture and who wants to take revenge against it.
Hmm.
The spookiest thing about all this is when you look at these supposedly crazy people, is that a lot of times they're all too sane in their analysis. Like, do you know Crazy Uncle Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber?
Oh, yeah.
Familiar with him? Yeah, like he had some sound criticisms of capitalism and modern industrial civilization, and immediately people freak out about any of this stuff because, again, nuance is dead. Like, we can't talk about this as sensible people who would agree that, okay, well, this terrorist or this sociopath or whatever you want to call them, that we're not including them in our category, because we are people who can talk to each other, right? And we can share a meal and we can do a lot of things together, let's say. Here was the
Okay.
other thing. Because it was about the language. Did you catch that story where it's like, in New York, they no longer use the term inmate. They're now called incarcerated persons. This is
Oh,
this
wow.
they took the time to pass this legislation. You don't know, I don't know how much time it took, how much money it took, what the purpose is, but the premise is, I guess, look, these people, they're no longer dependents or wards on the states. They're no longer criminals. They're no longer inmates. Maybe they've forgotten that we have put them in a tiny little box and left them there to rot. Not because now they're not inmates, they're incarcerated persons.
Yeah,
It's
they're organizing deck chairs on the Titanic, basically.
yeah, and but I don't know, maybe that's the sign of the futility, or that's the sign of just that's kind of like the decadent kind of aspect of it, right? Let them have their cake and eat it too. That's what it kind of reminds me
Well,
of,
I
right up
just
in.
Yeah, I just think it's almost like it's a parallel of what's going on in education because things are, metaphorically burning to the ground and people
Oh yeah,
feel
we should
so
get
out
back
of
into that.
control that they really they need to pick these random things to control so that they can feel a sense of autonomy. And even if the thing that they're trying to control is not the culprit or the problem, they can feel like they're bringing a solution and like they're necessary and like they're the heroes. And that's where we get terms like virtue signaling and everything like that.
Right. Yeah, the language. It's been
So
interesting
much in
to study how the
education.
language has changed.
Yeah, it's like in education, they know that they can't control what's going on with families. They can't or won't control what's going on with students. So who can they control? They can control the teachers because our paycheck, is basically what they hold over our head. And so they can blame us, they can try to control us, they can try to control our language and what we do in the classroom and make us all into drones. And then they can put the blame on us whenever it doesn't
Right.
work out. It's this vicious cycle. And there's people that should be taking accountability that aren't. And then all of that blame is placed on teachers. And it's this impossible bind because even with
No,
basic
yeah,
things like
definitely.
yeah, with basic things like testing, for example, I could be given a sheet of what they call standards that the students need to master, concepts, but I don't have any freedom to teach them in a way that I know is going to be helpful. And maybe some wacko, from central office or from some consulting company comes in and they've made up this new strategy or this new way that I need to teach. And every teacher in the room is thinking to themselves, this will never work. With kids, this is so stupid. But we're being told you have to teach this way. And then we've got administrators coming in our room to check to see if we're teaching that way. Meanwhile, we know it's
Right.
going to work to teach students, and we know that our job is on the line. So we're just in this impossible situation. It's
Oh,
like if you had a surgeon that was given, preschool sandbox tools and said, do surgery on this dying person, and then they're in trouble when the guy dies. It's like, well, what did you think? You gave me tools that wouldn't work and said I couldn't
uh,
use anything that in my expertise I know I need to use. And that's
we gave you the board game operation. We let you
yeah,
practice. Come on, like
yeah.
no. Okay,
Yeah, and then
so
they
this
blame the doctors, and never any talk about, oh, you took away my real tools and gave me preschool sandbox
right,
tools to
yeah, yeah,
operate.
and you tied my hands behind my back, and then so this brings up multiple problems. Okay, I'll put it forward like this: that teachers are afraid of admin are afraid of parent, what do you call it, county's afraid of state afraid of federal, the kids aren't afraid of anyone, and like and everyone's afraid of the kids.
Yeah.
That it is this climate of fear that, like you said, it just like those other aspects we talked about, that this climate of fear is reflected in our society as much as education. And that immediately, as you were talking, I thought of a few of the topics you broached before, because we've been kind of, in a very real sense, we've been kind of talking about the Orwellian nightmare in both education and elsewhere. But I thought of topics of, okay, the curriculum and how that's pushed, including the hiring of all these consultants who are just salesmen there to sell you pronouns and anti-racism and whatever weird cookbooks and answers they've come up with to experiment. Honestly, a lot of it seems like experimentation on the kids, because you and Nico and a lot of teachers talk about this, and this is what I don't understand, is they've turned you guys, and you've already mentioned this so far, that they've turned you're not just teachers, you're expected to do everything, including be the kids therapist. And that it's not only is it impossible for you, like, okay, here was Nico's quote. He said, how neurotic to think that, like, he said this one consultant was talking and he said something like, quote, what you're able to do for the child in this few hours in which you have them in your class can counteract everything else in their life, which and I know and Nico knows is a bald-faced lie at worst, or the most asinine optimism at best, right? It's just completely out of touch with reality. So I also wanted to ask you about these kind of consultants and these salesmen and this kind of, we're changing the curriculum all the time. That's one thing I'm putting on the table. And I'll try not to lose track of this here. And then the other thing that kind of went hand in hand with that, with what you were talking about, because Nico again said how neurotic to think that you can fix, a few hours, and you, the teacher who hardly has as much influence as the internet or his peers or her peers, or their parents, whether their parents are absent or together, right? That it's just delusional to think that.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and so between the ever-changing curriculum, the workshops, the consulting, And like you said, the teachers being in a position where you're told to constantly implement and change these things, yet you can hardly use your own basic common sense or intuition. Like where, I don't know. Can you talk about some of your own experience there? And let me just mention one more thing here, because it was on your last video where you were talking about, teacher advice and dealing with Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and someone in the comments was talking about, just remember to be careful out there, right? It goes back to this Orwellian stuff that, everyone there at work might put on a good, they might be able to put on a good front and a friendly face, but if you got to be careful who you talk to, because, they'll take anything you say and tell administration about it. And they said it happened to them, and what they advise is always leave your personal feelings and thoughts about school and students to yourself. Even people you think you can trust with your personal feelings, don't do it. If something was upsetting, talk to a close friend outside. So this gets into what you called in your videos the lie culture around teaching.
Definitely. Yeah, there's an enormous pressure. I don't know why. I imagine like a prison culture, but you want to get in good with the guards because maybe you don't have to clean the toilet. You can peel the potatoes instead.
Oh God. No wonder why it's so bad. It just brings out the worst in everyone, because then this is the worst aspect of tyranny, is especially petty tyranny, right? It's one thing when someone puts a gun to your head. It's another thing when you'll turn against your friend and neighbor for just an extra potato peel, like, or try to get ahead, or, put your foot on someone else's head, and just all that, the little betrayal. I know it's there in education, right, that you've talked about and this guy's talking about. And also, I think it's just everywhere in our culture. Like, there's a lot of stories you see about kids trying to like dox their parents and hurt their parents based on political beliefs, and it's like, even if the kid thought the parents were wrong or immoral, it's just, again, that all of this only seems to further the divide, it seems, right? Like, there's no, like, even the people who say they're selling answers are in fact furthering the divide.
Well,
And again, good luck to you.
Like our professional developments, we read this interesting book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And there's a lot of really interesting things and, sure, I think even helpful things in the book. But we had these forced diversity conversations over Zoom to be socially distanced, right? Even though we had kids in the building, but go figure. And so it was just really frustrating because topics would come up that would say things like, all white people are racist and Black people can't be racist. And so it was so interesting because I really tried to, be mindful of, not being the most controversial person in the room. But I feel like a lot of my thoughts aren't even that scary.
You should have started calling the white people their crackers and see how they acted. Like, all right, you crackers, let me tell you what's what.
I'm telling you. But yeah, I would say what I thought. You know what? I think racism is a heart issue. Therefore, a Black person can be racist, a white person can be racist. And
hatred absolutely is. And I think people take for granted that the issue about hatred isn't that it fits your ideology. It's what it does to a human's physiology. It, just like stress, it's how it's literally warps and twists their nervous system. Mm-hmm. That's the deadly problem of it. If you say it's a heart issue, like, I take that very literally and metaphorically. Yeah. But yes, it is. And also where the heart and mind meet, and where our internal world makes contact with our external world, right? Our perceptions are.
It was just very frustrating because, I don't know, I think I'm a naturally empathetic person. And so in some of these professional development meetings, I would think, you know what, I'm like hurt by this and I'm not even white. Like, I wonder how my white brothers and sisters feel. But the thing is if you said something like that, the first thing that would be said is like, why do we care how white people feel? They can take a back seat. They've had supremacy for so long. It doesn't matter how they make them feel. And so the conversations were often like couched in this air of we can be as angry, hurtful, disrespectful, and rude as we want to be. And everybody around just needs to sit and tolerate it. And if you're not with us, you're against us. If you're not with us, you're with racism. And it was different from school to school. I think some of the schools were trying to kind of integrate it in a more gentle fashion that still came across like a sledgehammer. Like
they're not subtle at all, are they?
Yeah, it was awful. We had, and it was like our back to school, professional development, and literally in this giant auditorium with all the teachers of the district, they put this giant paper on the wall, and we were supposed to write racial slurs and stereotypes and things that we've heard about every single race. So like Asians, Black women, Black men, gay men. They like broke down all of these categories And we were supposed to go write like slurs
And
and
wait,
things.
who are these people? Who are the people behind all this? I'm just curious.
The school district, the superintendent was leading it. And so we not only had to
I
write
feel
this,
like this is one of
go
those
and
things you
read
hear
it.
about where it's like superintendent gets fired for well-meaningly using a racial slur to say it's not okay to use this racial slur. That's the kind of thing I've seen that story of like all over the place in the
Yeah.
last 5 years.
Well, it was so interesting though, because, I I don't know, maybe I'm braver than I think. I did go up to the superintendent after and say, I really think that the focus needs to not be on this, but on raising accountability and standards
Oh,
and
you don't think we should focus on the mendacious race swindle?
Well,
You
the
don't
crazy
think?
thing is, it's so ironic because he cut me off in mid-sentence and began to talk over me. And I was thinking in my head, like, oh, intersectionally, you won't even listen to a black woman
Oh,
as a white
oh,
man. You're going to cut me off and tell me
dude.
how to
So,
fix my people.
the
But
crack. Look, the cracker was mansplaining to you. It's the
I'm telling
worst,
you,
dude. The worst sin. Like this is the worst of all sins.
it's so funny, but it really is. It was disturbing at the end of the day. But I would have people come up to me and say, thank you so much for saying this, because we're honestly afraid to say these things.
Well, it's
And we all,
disturbing. It's
yeah.
honestly, it's really disturbing because I see that as it's almost like you're trying to tell this guy, hey, do you not see your own dehumanization in this?
Mhm.
Because I think, again, this whole time I'm thinking of what Frederick Douglass said about slavery, because to make people pliable, to make them good slaves, they have to believe in their slavery,
Mm.
right? You have to
Yeah.
justify it to them,
Hmm.
and you can sell it as you can present it as slavery, or you can make it to where I guess this is where 1984 and Brave New World come into play. It's like, no, you have to make them want and like their slavery. It doesn't matter if they lose rights. It doesn't matter if things get worse. Just keep them as contented as possible and tell them whatever they need to hear. Let them channel their rage and their fear however they need to do it. But I think of Douglas saying that, you needed a slave thoughtless, and that again they need to believe in their own subjugation and they need to believe in their own dehumanization. And every time this mendacious race swindle stuff comes up, that's exactly where my head goes. It doesn't matter how you try and justify it, it's the same dehumanization.
Well, and the irony to me is that truly racist people, which I have encountered, by the way, like I'm not of the side that
Sure.
says racism doesn't exist. You're not going to change those people's minds and hearts with this nonsense. You're actually making them
No,
more
you're encouraged.
racist.
Oh, absolutely. not
Yeah.
not that anyone, I think fundamentally just the way people are, we don't need a reason to hate, but we will rationalize anything.
Yeah, and I mean, I think at the end of the day, my view is so simple. I just think that literally for, students of color, disadvantaged, whatever the case, all students, we need to give them the best education humanly possible so that they have options. If they want to go into a
Right.
trade, great. If they want to go to community college, great. If they want to go to university, great. But they all need to at least
Right. Well,
have
they need,
that
yeah, they
chance.
need to compete. They need to be
Yeah.
able to, right? And
Well, and
then the
that's the
concern
thing.
is for all this lip service. Let me ask you this real quick. What are your thoughts? Because I think it gets real grim the further I look out. It's like, look, we've seen riots and problems before, and we've seen, lots of people out of work before. And it's like as we keep going forward, as more people are put out of work through technology and other means, and as things get more expensive and as things change and it's harder and harder for people to skate by, and it does really seem like the corporate and governmental America and the West at large really does want us on, the grid in a major, like they want, their fingers are in our lives as much as possible. They want as much as possible from us. It's like they're going to maintain stricter controls, especially, and you see it, I think, in a lot of the legislation and policy and idealism that does deal with the future, whether we're talking education or climate change. It's just there that in the same way that teaching is a sacrificial field where you guys are expected to sacrifice your health and your everything to, again, I told you I didn't understand how you guys could be the students' therapists because technically teachers aren't even licensed to be therapists. So I don't know how they got away with that, to try and teach you guys to be their therapists. And I guess if you need serious intervention, then I kind of get it to a point, but it's clearly wrong, and it's clearly, missing the point of education.
Well, yeah, and that's where our great edu consultants would come in. We had programs like BIST, BIST, and they would talk about all of these different skills that students were missing. So the idea was that if a student misbehaves, it's because they don't know the rule, they don't understand the rule, or they don't know how to implement the
Oh
rule.
yes, I've
It's
heard some of this.
never
Yes.
Yeah, nowhere in the conversation was kids are misbehaving because it's fun. They totally understand the rules. They understand the rationale. They understand everything, but they don't want to do what they're told to do because there's no consequences. That conversation was not allowed to be had. So we would find ourselves needing to do ridiculous things. Like if a kid is acting
Well,
up.
do you think they believe that? Whoever was selling that, like whatever consultant who was probably paid six figures to sell that, right? Like, were you in a workshop and they're sitting there going, "Here's this and here's that"? Is
Yeah,
that
they
how?
would come once a week to have our BISC meetings, and they would ask us about our toughest cases and then try to show us how BISC would work in that situation. And I actually have a funny story, come to think of it. This
Sure.
poor kid, he was, we'll call him SpongeBob. He was one of the most disturbed children I had ever encountered in my life. He would throw desks, he would rip apart bulletin boards, he would scream and curse and freak out. He would say the most vilest things. And we found out, he was in a foster care situation and had a tough background. But we would tell this
Right.
BIST lady about this kid, and she would say things like, "Oh, you just need to have him practice picking up a tissue box and walking back and handing it to you, because that's going to show him how to
Oh
follow
God,
directions because
what
he
a
doesn't
what a total
understand."
fart. What a total farce in terms of not understand. More than anything, what's alarming is, okay, again, these people, like, they're trying to play psychologists and therapists, and they're not. And see, now I'm getting angry because I think about this and I think about the real trauma, how this kid is running a marathon, how his physiology is stressed to its breaking point, how this kid has serious problems, and
Mhm.
this is how he's treated, and this is the attitude of the education. Because it's like, if there's failure everywhere else in his life, and that's what it's been, and then these are again the maybe she means well, but we shouldn't hire well-meaning idiots. You need people who can do the job. You need ideas that actually work. And
Right.
look, that was one acronym, one thing. How much of that stuff did you have over the years? How many
A lot.
workshops? How many? Is that where
Oh,
all the money's going in education these
I
days? Is it
really
just,
think so.
is
Because
it six-figure consultants with these bullshit ideas? Pardon my
yeah.
French. I'm mad here.
Oh, it's terrible. And that's what, we get our professional development, quote, quote, time wasted, which is actually our planning time. The only time that is carved aside for us to actually plan lessons, they get taken up with these ridiculous meetings. And there was just all kind of programs. There's Love and Logic, there's Positive Discipline, there's BIS, there's Restorative Justice, Restorative Circles. There's all these different names for just these hyper positive alleged, consequence systems, which really amount to having no consequences
Oh
whatsoever. The
shoot! You know what I'm
consequence.
thinking now?
Go ahead.
Sorry, it just popped in my head. I want to share this with you and get your thought.
Yeah.
I'm wondering. I'm thinking. Let's assume it's as earnest as possible, and then my thoughts are, well, this is just kind of the modern therapeutic approach to try and staunch the bleeding, right? This is
Yeah.
I knew this before. I heard it, to try to articulate in a very particular way. That, again, thinking about that little boy, right? The desk flipper you were
Mhm.
talking about.
Yeah.
Thinking about how much, like, I could think of countless examples of traumatized or abused children and how much intervention they would need and
Mhm.
have needed to avoid becoming statistics, right?
Yeah.
And I mean that whether it's a suicide or a slow death by alcoholism or other addictions, that these are very real things. And you've seen them. Like, you've
Yeah.
probably seen what it's like, a lot of this dysfunction that goes unseen, again, for all the lip service to, oh, we're helping people, and, oh, we care about the poor and the minorities and the disenfranchised. And it's like, yeah, you care, but from a good long six-figure distance.
Well, and
Like,
it's the redefining of words again.
yeah.
Things aren't misbehavior. They're not rebellion. They're not disrespect. We're not allowed to use those words. And essentially, it's like we're
Wait, what
trying to.
word? What words have been memory hold or blacklisted?
Well, we're not supposed to say things like kids are being disrespectful, kids like, and there's been whole conversations that no longer can students be written up for disrespect. No longer can they have any
Right,
kind of consequence for that because it's considered to be
right.
culturally oppressive
Well,
because,
don't worry, because in the future they will no longer be. They're no longer students. They're future incarcerated peoples. How about that?
yeah, it's terrible.
I
And
know.
another thing that would just upset me so much because truthfully, like as a Black woman who has actually experienced racism, I know that I need to be at the top of my game. I need to, again, be able to compete with anyone. And a lot of times, if I'm in a community that truly does have some racial issues, the magnifying glass is going to be on me more, not less. They're going to be looking
Oh,
for me to
sure.
mess up more, not less.
Yeah,
And
I saw that you talked about that in your, was that the charter school or the private school
probably the private
where
school. Yeah.
it was just kind of that, like,
Oh, it was
what
awful.
is tucked away suburban white America.
Yeah, it was awful. And that I really truly believe that that place did have some serious racial problems. And the school acknowledged it. They had professional development about it. They said I was the only Black teacher in the whole school of a K through 12, situation. And they talked about how they are constantly losing Black families. And there was a lot of subtle weirdness, like Black students, they would make up Black names for them and be like, hey, Javante, hey, Jerome. And his name was like Timothy, just really subtle. Like,
Okay. Dude, well, it just reminds me. It does to a certain degree, like, because I think there's a side that we get lost on this. The kids are easily cruel, and I remember hearing this one comedian recently saying that, like, when you're a kid and something happens to you, that becomes your nickname. Like, we had a guy who lost an eye, he became Blinky, right? And I remember even I think of a Chris Rock bit where he's talking about if someone rear ends him, he talks about how we go for the lowest hanging fruit. He says if someone rear ends him and he gets out and it turns out it's like a midget with one leg, then he's going to be yelling at this one-legged midget and telling him, he's going to go for what. So there is that side of it that's easy to take for granted, and that kids will take advantage if they do see that they are given. Because I see it two ways: of one, they have too much freedom and leeway; they're not given proper discipline,
Mhm.
and right, that those things aren't maintained, that structure isn't maintained on one side, and that other side that, what point does a joke become hatred? Because it's a
Yeah.
serious question.
Well, yeah, and this particular school
Excuse me.
is just ridiculous. I was teaching 7th and 8th grade. They made memes of me calling me a drunk, a lesbian, like making fun of my husband, like super random stuff. Like, and they just were, I don't know, they were
Hey,
evil. Like they made up
and were these kids also not allowed to be written up for disrespect?
the private school was a little bit strange. You had certain families, it was like the mafia that you couldn't touch them, especially the board member
These
kids.
guys own the bowling alley. Don't mess with them, right? These
Oh,
guys own the
absolutely. Yeah, the
construction.
gun range. One of them, literally, their family owned a gun range in the little weird town.
Yeah,
But
see, you want to be in with him, right? That's exactly who you want to
and
be
that
in
was
with. You.
the solution, oddly enough, that the administration tried to give me. And I was so naive. I just didn't understand this world. So they're like, you need to befriend these powerful moms and they'll kind of help you out. And I was just confused. I'm like, wait, but their, kid, is like calling me names and being terrible and like it was always that reframing. I literally heard from the principal, oh, that's the middle school animal. Kids will be kids. The principal's son wrote up a petition to get me fired within the first 3 weeks and had like 2/3 of the 7th graders sign it. I mean, these kids were like out for blood and
Wow, they're motivated, man. I'm impressed that at least they're doing stuff, like better than just sitting on their phone all day. Sorry.
yeah, well, it's kind of interesting though, because there was much more of an academic focus at this particular school,
Right.
and
Oh, because
did
they're paying good.
differ
If the parents are paying good money,
oh yeah,
then
$1,000
you're.
a month.
Oh no, and I remember you actually said you on that matter you said that they're basically they begin to see themselves as stakeholders, so they kind of call you like they feel like they have the luxury to call you or tell you what to
Oh
do
yeah.
and all these other things. And
Yeah. Yeah, so in that regard, they were a little bit more serious about academics. And I did find the kids were a bit more hardworking. They were a little bit more motivated. And it was kind of weird with behavior. There were some parents that would not be okay with what their kids were doing. But the vast majority of them, I found like 80% of them were very entitled and they just flipped the problem back on me. And I found out quickly, like, you're supposed to do everything to make these parents happy. Oh my goodness, like teachers were treated so horrible. And so that's why even I love people comment all the time, private school is your answer. Work at a private Christian school. And I'm like, yep, been there, done that. And it gave me PTSD, like literally, like it was so
right.
bad.
Well, hey, I don't know. Look. You said people have different reactions to this. Like some people would be upset that you broached the subject, or some people would be upset that you brought up rate, like depending on where you're at, they would be upset for you to even bring up something like racism. What as if on one side it isn't real and on the other side as if it's because it's like, okay, whether they want to consider it the worst problem in the world compared to other human behaviors. Because I think there are a few, like there's things beyond racism that are just as bad and worse, right? Like that's not that it's like human, like the depths of hatred in humanity doesn't stop and start with racism. It doesn't start or end there, right? It goes deeper than that, and it's wider ranging than that. So it's a
Yeah,
serious
and
problem that I don't think that the current dialogue and the discourse, remotely addresses. And it obviously is frustrating for everybody. Like, because look at where we're at. Again, we've reached our different conclusions. We have a complete cultural divide, and like I said, I call it a civil war. Both
yeah.
with the people against themselves and one another, as well as the government is also at odds with itself. But that's another interlocking ring in this kind of cultural disillusion, right? And this coming apart.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get too off track because we've been tracking through this Orwellian nightmare. You had brought up a bigger topic earlier about, where we got into both on one side, the consulting, and the other side, I guess, is some of these just human relations and race relations. I asked, like, how many different, can you even remember all the acronyms and all the different programs? Because you've talked about how.
Interesting. Some had formal names, like the ones that I mentioned, like the BIS, Love and Logic, Positive Discipline, Restorative Justice.
It all sounds so new age.
Right.
I'm trying not to cringe too much in the sense that, again, okay, maybe a well-meaning idiot put this together, but go on.
Well, and it's just this idea that I think you actually brought it up earlier. The question is humanity primarily good or not? And that's kind of, I guess,
Oh,
again, controversial. But I think a lot of these people believe, like, kids, if they just understand your rule, of course they'll obey it. Or the worst is, oh, if you can just make them like you, if you can do something magically, some kind of unicorn sprinkle dust over their forehead,
oh,
and if
is that getting into the kind of educationally themed infotainment?
oh
They
yeah.
want you to impress the kids and astound them and kind of jazz them, and aren't you cool and hip, and aren't you teaching them to learn?
Yeah, and while at the same time, this again is so ironic to me, they're giving us these ridiculous, boring, stupid curriculums and forcing us to use them. Because actually, when administrators and everyone just left me alone, I think I actually created real magic in the classroom. So I know that it is possible. There was a few
Oh,
situations.
that's the creative. Well, that's kind of the definition of an art and a creative process, is that the moment it's defined by restriction, but the moment you have everyone and everything stamping on it, it's like, oh shit, good luck.
Yeah, and it was interesting. The first 2 years, I kind of had a principal that didn't know what she was doing. And so she kind of left me alone. And so I got some time to kind of try different things. And then there was 2 years at one school district where the principal got so sick, from being at the job that he literally had to take medical leave. So we kind of had like
Common
interim
story too.
principals.
In case listeners didn't know, it's common story. Teachers quit for their health and they can't even work because of their health,
Yeah, and that's
because of the job and how stressful and toxic and.
Yeah. And so I got a taste of what it would be like for me to have a creative idea. For example, back in, 2015, 2016 school year, when there was elections, I created mock elections with the students because I taught English and social studies, and they researched the ideas. They had mock debates. They wrote papers on it. They were excited. They felt like they knew what was happening. Like, it was just educational gold. And these were sixth graders. But I could have never gotten away with something like that if the principal wasn't out sick, literally, and we didn't have some interim principal that didn't really care what was going
Right.
on. That year, I was able to read 14 full-length novels with the kids. That soon got banned.
14.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
because
mean,
I've done my research both inside and outside of YouTube, and I've looked at teachers forums where, teachers are going like, did you guys all just give up on novels? Because the problem is a lot of the kids, they can't even engage in they don't even have the reading comprehension to do it. And this ranges from kids who in theory like absolutely have the potential to at least understand a little bit better, but they just don't have it because they were never really taught how to read, and they
well,
were
what
never
I
taught
would do
in
to
school.
fix that problem was I would have an audiobook playing, and then they would have the physical book in their hands and they would follow along. So they were able to hear it and see it at
See
the
it,
same
right?
time, which actually, incidentally, is a really great way to help kids learn how to read. And we
Yeah, it
did.
dials them in. It dials them in a bit versus if you're just reading, it leaves your own mind's eye, right? Like you're a reader, so I think you have an idea what this looks like. That when you're reading and following, it really is a unique experience when you're just using your eyes as a technology, because you're creating the picture in your head. And then if you also hear the audio, I feel like it dials you in a bit more, which is probably actually a pretty good thing to do for modern kids, given, cell phone distractions and things like that, how flighty us modern people are with our phone addictions.
Well, yeah, and it was just so beautiful to see kids engaged in the beauty of story. I could literally cry talking about it. It's so sad with all the test prep. There's these short garbage paragraphs that look like they were written by a crazy person themselves that we're supposed to so boring. Like, okay, find the main idea and circle this vocabulary word versus a real classic novel, and we could
Right.
get into
Something that might teach you, to make you question your humanity or look at your humanity or question how you've lived your life, or all these things that literature and art can do for you, show you beauty, show you things you've never seen before.
Yeah, and honestly,
literally expand your world. It begins abstractly, right? It expands our mind. It begins as this weird abstraction, but it's absolutely reflected in our physical reality. Freedom of the mind, freedom of the body always follows freedom of the mind. I don't think it goes the other way around. You know what I mean? I mean this very practically, right? I don't mean this idealistically. Just thinking on what reading and education and all these things actually, how they affect us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think curiosity has been lost in the mix. Excitement has been lost in the mix because no one would believe me. But, since I was the English and the social study teacher, I actually got out our world history textbooks and we would read them together and kids would ask questions and we would talk about it. And we would have surprisingly thoughtful conversations where we could authentically link it into current events. It was this beautiful organic process instead of me shoving weird ideologies down kids' throats when they had no context to understand history or relate it to anything else ever.
I know that's a crucial point that I guess the zealots kind of miss in their overexcitement to teach them. It's well, you're teaching them to be these kind of self-destructive tumbleweeds, and I don't think they understand that, though, even if they mean well.
Mm-hmm. I just think that there's got to be some kind of potential left somewhere in some context for teachers to enjoy teaching and students to enjoy being taught. But
I haven't found it, just so you know. And
yeah,
all the teachers and admin I've known, because I know, look, a lot of them that I've known, they've already quit. They're getting into other businesses or other jobs. A few of them have wound up as pronoun salesmen and anti-racism salesmen. And I mean that literally. They're consultants who go around. I guess this is where the money goes, I guess.
I gotta be honest with you. In my desperation, I was like, dang, I need to be a BIS consultant. What am I doing teaching?
Oh, dude, you could go wag your finger and be like, listen, you crackers, look, I'm not racist. You guys are racist. Stop sucking and just wag your finger at them. And then if they dare to have a shred of self-esteem or humanity, you just tear them down.
Well, BIST is the goofy little behavior system where essentially there's a safe seat, there's think sheets, and there might be reflection rooms. And so it's this whole system basically where you are trying to identify what skill is the child missing if they won't stop talking all day. And then they need to go sit in the safe seat and fill out a think sheet. And maybe I take them aside and process with them. And, for a certain subset of students, that kind of thing works. But for most of them these days, I just don't think it does. And for a second, I really did consider, should I just become some kind of consultant? But I'm like, I really don't think I could live with myself, because a part of me really did wonder, am I just doing BIST wrong? Is there a better way to do BIST? But what happens is kids get used to anything you do.
Oh, well, teachers are, like you said, the teachers are always to blame. That was the comment across this country, across the spectrum. I heard it from teachers. I heard it from admin. I've seen it firsthand.
Yeah, and it's just it really gets in your head. You do feel kind of crazy sometimes because it's kind of like the gaslighting process and
oh yeah, no, I was about to say that is the Orwellian nightmare, right? It's the cognitive dissonance to hold two different things simultaneously in your head while purging the other, and then being able to forget or recall any of them at any given time to continue on this process. The full explanation of what doublethink is kind of along those lines. I need to actually look at it to make sure I got the rationale and the words right, off the top of my head here. But it's something like that. And you questioning that right there, that's what pops into my mind. This is what doublethink does to people.
Yeah, and it really tears you down. I feel like my self-esteem, so to speak, was so torn down by teaching, especially in
How are
certain.
you now, by the way? I hope you've no, you deserve, I absolutely believe you deserve better than that. I know you deserve better than that. How are you doing these days?
You know,
It's almost like having an abusive partner. That's what a lot
oh,
of what you discussed
absolutely.
reminds me of.
Well,
That they just gaslight you and tear you
yeah.
down.
Well, after that private school experience, I literally would break down crying trying to fill out job applications. I went to a local teacher store and nearly started crying in the teacher store, like looking at the supplies because I felt like such a failure. And I had been like so beaten down by parents, so made fun of, mocked, literally bullied by these people, and had the
Oh,
administration gaslight me and say, "This is your
yeah.
fault. What are
No, and that
you
makes it
doing?"
hard. That makes
Mhm.
it hard to actually assess, right? Like, where can you, because you could say, okay, I did some things wrong or I made some mistakes. And then when you actually try and analyze, if you're trying to analyze the situation and you actually have no, I was gonna say no positive feedback, but I was just gonna say no real feedback at all. Because again, if everything's either double speak or doesn't mean what they say, or it's backwards, or what do you call it? Like no one's being honest. How
Mhm.
could you ever know? How could you ever fix that? And I don't think you
Yeah.
can.
Yeah, and that's where it goes back to. I really think, teaching is a shared responsibility. And I just imagine a pie chart where everybody's got a percentage depending on the age of the students. The parents have a percentage of responsibility, the students have it, the administration and the school culture has a percentage, the teacher has a percentage, and in some kind of way, society has a percentage of that pie.
Oh
And what
yes.
happened is they've made the whole pie the teacher.
Oh,
you
okay. Now that we're here, speaking of this, if anyone's interested, there's a 4-hour education blowout special on my YouTube channel here. That's the same place as this will be. But you heard that. Did you remember hearing the guy who was saying, look, arguably, if your teacher can't tell little Johnny to go sit down and it becomes a
Yes.
45-minute ordeal, arguably you don't have a school.
I nearly
Argu
cheered when I heard that because
Yeah,
it's
that guy seemed like a cool admin, huh? Because you heard him.
absolutely.
He's like I didn't mess with my teachers. If they're good at lecturing, let them lecture. If they're good at this, let them do that, right? Like
Yeah.
that's and that he was breaking all the rules or a lot of the rules and that approach because it actually doesn't mesh well with the hyper monitored, hyper data selecting, kind of wishy-washy system that's in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Oh, we haven't really gotten into that, like explaining how much testing there is
oh,
and
yeah,
how much monitoring there is and
I would be
how
happy to talk about that. It's insane.
so a lot of the teachers did kind of think that way and it wasn't a lot of it was very practical. It wasn't necessarily some ideal like they weren't proposing an idealistic thing like, oh, we're all responsible, like because it's proven that if we are all responsible, then either these present modern people are either incapable of that responsibility or they're slacking it off. There's a few different ways you could interpret it, but that's what a lot of the teachers were pointing out that you don't have a school. If you can't actually teach the kids and discipline them, you don't have a school. And he said, arguably, you don't even have a society.
Yes.
And he pointed it out in other examples, like in broader society. If these people can't do their jobs, if they can't even tell people to avoid this area for safety, and everyone has this consumeristic mentality, like you're the teacher, you're the one who makes them come, you better do it. Like again, teachers always to blame, and he said that too. Teachers always to blame. It doesn't matter how bad admin screws up. Doesn't matter how bad county screws up. It doesn't matter how bad the funding system is to begin with. Or like that comedian teacher Devin Siebold talked about when he said that he got a congratulations one school year because it was their most tested school year where they administered over 17,000 tests. And he goes, that's nothing to celebrate. That's an abomination, because
Absolutely.
the kids don't appreciate the test. They don't respect them when there's that many. They don't even learn that. They don't learn anything, right? Like,
Well, yeah, and everything. I think there's so many things that idealistically sound good, but all you have to do is talk to a teacher to know in 5 seconds whether it'll really work. And so with the standards-based movement, it's this really beautiful idea that like, why have solid deadlines and grades? We're ever evolving, ever
uh,
learning humans. Why can't they infinitely take the test until they understand
you
it?
don't
Why?
have the funding to be Waldorf, okay? Public school system. You do not
Yeah.
have the funding to be Waldorf. You
Well,
can't be having this like if rich people are okay with their kooky kid not learning how to read by second grade by going to this expensive private school, fine. Not cool for public
Well, yeah, and again, it goes back to that human nature question. In an idealistic, perfect world, students wouldn't take advantage of a system with infinite deadlines, if infinite chances, and the ability to sometimes literally retake the same exact test and memorize the answers. And so it's like these either willfully evil or not too bright people, not sure which one, are just not like that's not even allowed to be a part of the conversation. And it takes me back to my zeros or toxic professional
Oh
development.
yeah.
Oh, it was just it made
Well,
I was
what's the
so
name of that program? What's the name of that consulting
it
group?
was
Like
a
who?
part of the standards-based grading movement, and I don't know that that in and of itself has a name, but even I want to say I think it's Edutopia or something. One of the huge ed
Edutopia?
magazines. Yeah, I
Oh,
think
I did see that. That I feel like that's borderline Orwellian too.
yeah, I'll have to find the name of this like giant, educational publishing thing, but I think that they even had an actual article
Oh
about
yeah, it really is quite the racket, huh? Like they make a lot of money selling. I mean, from even in like the college thing is a problem too for the students. Like that, if there was ever a racket, it was the college textbook one. But let's go on about this one.
Oh yeah, it's edutopia.org, by the way. But anywho, yeah, and so it's just it doesn't work realistically. And what happened in our district is I think what happens with a lot of urban districts that are failing in terms of their like district report card, sometimes they will look at better resourced suburban schools where things actually work for some odd reason, and they'll try
Right.
to bring it into urban districts, but they will only implement it like 14% of the actual program. And so their idea was get rid of all grades. So homework doesn't count, projects, in classwork, there's no grades except for what's called benchmark tests.
Everybody's
And,
a winner.
well, and it's so weird because essentially, of course, nobody's going to do work for the most part if nothing's graded. And then parents lose sight of
I feel
the
like I
idea
was
of like
ripped off because
self-fulfilling.
like when I slacked off and when I skipped school and all that stuff, like it was seldom that I could ever get away with anything, right? Like they never like they would get you on a lot like I mean I guess in the grand total I did, but you know what I mean? Like I'm saying that it was inevitable. Like that was back when schools still punished kids and
Yeah.
rightfully so. And
Yeah.
and it all serves a purpose. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm just thinking like, man, I went to school during the wrong era. Like I could have been a complete screw off. But
Get a
I know
Calvin's
the
degree in going to Yale.
yeah. Well, again, I know that would have had deleterious effects on my life. So I'm glad it wasn't the case. I'm glad I was held to standards. I'm glad my teachers had less shitty acronyms and weren't stuck on a lot of these stupid programs and policies that don't work.
Well,
That produce failure in kids.
yeah. And it honestly it makes the teachers essentially into liars because there's so much pressure to like fudge data and
Oh
change
yeah.
words.
You've talked about that.
Yeah, and so it's just horrible, really.
How much of
I
that
mean,
did you see? I know that fits right into the fact that again, I'd say what a double-faced culture and a lie
well,
culture. Because
and that's the irony. That kind of goes into the conversation of how like you can't really trust other teachers. I've only had one ever admitted. One flat out admitted, you know what, I just changed those scores, because we essentially, in my particular state, we have this state linked evaluation where we give these kids these diagnostic tests and then these different benchmark tests, and they're supposed to take it, I want to say twice a year. I think maybe the first time they take it, that's called like a pre-test, and you're supposed to give it to them when they've learned nothing about it so that the grade looks really low. And then you give it to them again after having taught the unit, so it looks like they grew by like 900%. um, and so,
wow,
yeah, and that happens
it's
all
like that.
the
See,
time.
that's like direct marketing, the honest lie. That's like, hey,
Yeah. Well, and
oh,
that's
speaking of
how,
honest lies, real quick, I just one of the if do you remember the teacher on the project where she was saying that like when the classroom gets disrupted and when they
oh,
didn't get
yeah.
to that they never get a chance to send a note home saying sorry we didn't get to math today because some kid was having a meltdown, sorry that your children were traumatized by this fight or this violence, the parents don't know and they don't want the parents to know
Oh,
because of
absolutely.
course the parents would lose their minds because I know it's increasing that Americans are catching on. And let me point this out because we as Americans have been saying this for a long time. Our education system sucks. We know that. Everyone knows it. Everyone's been saying the same thing for, I'm not trying to be cynical or mean here.
Yeah.
It's been an issue for a long time. And it's in our comedy and it's in our media and it's in the news. And that, like you said, with that climate of fear, it's that everyone's worried about the bad optics. No one wants to be a meme. No one wants to wind up on the news. And
Yeah.
that, again, at the end of the day, it's fear that's ruling. And because of that, it's destroying the potential for these kids' educations. And,
Mhm.
again, for hearing all these people say, we care about children, like I'm so sick. If I hear another person, if I hear another Westerner say they care about the children, I'm going to say the shit you don't. In a wider context in our society, it's clear we don't. If we cared
Yeah.
about kids, there would be laws in place to say you can't use social media till you're 18 because it has such terrible effects on their psyche and their brains, right? Like if we cared about a lot of these things, we would have done something. And I guess this is what one of the teachers also said, right? He said, no one takes the care for education.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And he talked about as being a black male in the education profession, less than 1% black male. And as a result, because of all this mendacious race swindle stuff, that they put him as, no matter where he goes, it's like, oh, we got to cater to this notion of diversity. Look, get our token black guy, right? Like that's how they treated him. It sounded like they wouldn't even acknowledge that they couldn't acknowledge to him that that's how they used him and treated him.
Definitely. And in the mix, all of this, kids realize really quickly, like, okay, I'm not going to be held accountable. I don't really, really have to do my work. And so then I think teachers, it feels like a lottery system. One year, I just so happened to have like 6 kids that were considered, to be gifted and talented. And I had a fairly good group of kids. But my co-teacher, we exchanged kids. I taught the social studies and English, and she taught math and science.
Mm-hmm.
She had like 5 kids that didn't know English and like 5 special education students.
Sorry,
And overall,
I'm just going like, dude, that's a full load right there, probably.
yeah, and overall, like her
Behavioral
class
problems
was
and
just,
needs.
performing much lower academically. We would both be told you both need to have, 90% of your students passing. And they would always say there's no excuse. You need to figure it out. They call it differentiating education. You need to make different worksheets. You need to find what they call scaffolds in order to, meet the kids at their level. And there's all of these impossible issues. And then a lot of
Yeah, no, I
times,
mean, it kind of, some of the jargon and stuff, like you can kind of understand what they mean in the sense that,
yeah,
hey, like I meet anyone in the street, like I'm going to assess what's the divide between me and you. How can I speak to you in a way that, the way that we can understand each other? It's just basic human stuff, right? I feel like that even if we don't really talk like these, it's not like we go around talking about this sort of stuff, right? It's not really apparent, but it is just kind of how we treat each other.
yeah.
And so it makes sense, but dude, a teacher can't do that with multiple classes of 20 to 30 students, usually closer to 30 students, right? Depending on
Yeah.
your school system. But with a
Yeah.
lot of the public schools.
And I think the heart of the matter, this is the other thing that you're just not allowed to say. It doesn't matter how much, money is poured in, how many shiny iPads, how many awesome, fun, engaging computer programs. If the kid is coming and they don't have the value for education and they don't want it, it's like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And that is what our current educational system refuses to acknowledge. And that goes back to the accountability piece, because in a perfect situation, the parents would be the ones that's pushing kids, because we know that they can inherently be a little lazy. I mean, we all were. I'm sure most of us as kids, we didn't really want to work and do homework, and that's where the parents are supposed to come in.
Oh yeah, and there's lots of temptations and reasons not to. There's good reasons for kids to question the world around them, which is ideally what, again, back to education. Hey,
Yeah.
you don't want to be a chump. Hey, you don't want to be helpless in this world. Hey, you don't want to be subject to mass forces that you can never compete with or overcome in any meaningful manner, or live alongside, or achieve anything or do anything meaningful to you. I could break it down in a number of ways, because
Mhm.
it really is a question of, people define success differently, but success or failure usually only means one thing, and it just means, utter failure. Like you haven't achieved what you wanted, you failed at your goal, you didn't go anywhere, you didn't do anything. That's a big problem. As
Yeah.
more losers stack up at the bottom, it's like, absolutely, this is part of why America's so unstable right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that for at least urban schools, I feel like the investment really truly needs to be in volunteers, people to help kids read, mentors, for children that don't have fathers, for there to be like healthy,
Oh,
safe father
there's
figures.
another thing that's tiptoed around and rationalized and justified. Talk about the problem of fatherlessness in America, and
Yeah.
people want to be like, oh no, you can have peoples of all Like, well, you call, like they're probably called, like they're no longer called parents, or like
Birthing
people.
persons.
Yeah, birthing persons and peoples of varied sexuality. It's like, no, you guys are making all this shit up for millions of years. Primates and social animals lived thus. Like, don't give us this nonsense. I mean,
Well,
that's
in
not to
Teach
say
for
you can't have.
America, yeah, my actual training program, there was literally a guy that got up and like ranted about how wrong it is, this concept that we need fathers, because he was like a black male that, didn't have a father in his life. And he was just going on and on about how we don't actually need fathers and we need to
So he
quit
drank the
saying
Kool-Aid
that.
too, or he
And
bought
this was
in
back in
too.
2013. I mean, TFA was like super, super like kind of radical left even back in 2013. And actually, I've had a few people ask me to do a video talking about Teach for America, so that might be my next video. But yeah, it's just there's all these things that we're not allowed to say. And I think that I totally agree that there is generational poverty, there's generational mindsets, there's ways of thinking and
Well, like you
seeing
said,
the world.
addiction's huge, and then the
Oh,
way
yeah.
it affects the child's huge. Like, there's a lot. Yeah,
Well, yeah,
it's a
and like
complex
even in
web.
my own family, my grandmother was actually a Holocaust survivor. And so it's really sad, like looking at her kids, she was so traumatized that essentially all the people on my dad's side of the family are hardcore drug addicts or alcoholics, and they've just lived really rough lives because there's like that idea of generational trauma and poverty. And I mean, my dad was able to go into the military and he got a job as kind of like a computer software and networking guy. So, I mean, he did have, some degree of success, but
No,
I think,
there's a psychologist who survived, like Auschwitz, I think it was, and she wound up a psychologist, and she came to concern herself with children and how you treat children, and she really cared, and you could tell she was trying to understand how it is we repressed and abused, and and I mean like Westerners broadly, right? Going like, how does Europe wind up in that situation? You come over here to America, how does America wind up in this situation? But even her son, as a psychologist, said like, yes, look, everyone loves her and she's helped so many people, but she was a horrible mother just
mhm,
because
so
she was
traumatized.
traumatized.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
and obviously, that if that's the case, she left that pain and damage in him. It doesn't mean he's broken. Let's try and draw a divide here between the notion of the way stress and trauma is internal in the body. It's in the body, recreated in the mind. Like the whole notion of PTSD is your mind can't rationalize you're safe. Your body doesn't realize it's not in the same stressful situation. It can't stop. It's almost like a resentment, right? You can't stop this re-feeling essentially. It's
Mhm.
this disconnect. It's a serious problem. That's what the generational trauma reminds me of. In fact, PTSD, and that when parents are damaged, wounded, hurt, broken, whatever you want to call it, that they inevitably affect their children, and that can happen through their presence or their absence.
Yeah, and
Sorry, I'm getting a little bit off here, but I just wanted to point out because it's different from what we talked about it earlier. I think it's important to point out that we said we don't. I said I didn't buy into it. It sounds like you didn't buy into it either. When you said someone is I guess it's the term historically marginalized. That's the one where it's like, that's the one that tries to say, that's the one that leans toward learned helplessness.
mhm.
So that's
Yeah,
why I didn't like that one.
yeah, and I think that that's where, I feel like by virtue of a lack of options, I kind of tend to be more on like the conservative side a little bit. But in terms
Oh,
of
well,
like,
you get it that there's no free lunch. Maybe,
well,
and you lived it too. So, and I think this
yeah.
is the divide between a lot of these wealthy middle managerial, what education is, 80% white women. Like,
Mhm.
I'm not trying to be rude. I'm not trying to blame them, but I think there's a big disconnect. There's a class disconnect. There's a race
Yeah.
disconnect. And honestly, given again, that we've been discussing the Orwellian aspect to all this, there's very much a dehumanization aspect and a loss of our, I don't know, a lot of our basic decency and values, a lot of our, and I'm not going to say like it was ever as united as people say it was, right?
Yeah.
That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying, I think we're further dehumanizing ourselves. I think we're
Oh,
further
yeah.
turning ourselves into consumerist mindset, either machines or robots or even horrors. Maybe I'll edit that out, but I can't help but feel that way a little bit with
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
modern
Well, it's
society.
well, and that kind of, I was going to say that I do, I tend to be, if there's such thing as a bleeding heart conservative, then that's what I would be, because I do have enormous compassion for people that are suffering and traumatized and poor. and witnessing violence. And so my solution, not that I think
Well,
that
sure.
this
And I
was,
think it's because you've been there, right? Like how
yeah, oh yeah,
it's
yeah,
not some
absolutely.
vague theory. It's not some theory to you. You've seen it. You've lived through it. And this is, again, I get angry just thinking about these things. Sorry, go on.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, I was just gonna say that. That's where I do get annoyed with my like conservative brethren, because it's like they do just want to say,
they
oh, well,
overlook. Yeah, they do. No, they do. They
they'll
overlook.
say like, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You have
Dude,
the same.
that honestly, I get the notion, and in a sense, they're not wrong. In the
Mhm.
sense that, look, if I as a man in this world don't figure my shit out, you think anyone feels sorry for me? You think anyone gives a shit? You think you think if I treated myself as disposable, that anyone's really going to give me a medal that matters to that as much as my life matters to me? You know what I mean? Like, and it goes
Yeah.
for you too, as a woman and as a teacher and as whatever you want to, whatever anyone thinks of themselves as, right?
Hmm.
And this is what gets me is that we've created this system that has the utter illusion of caring and humanity, like, and
Yep.
we have this fiction and mythos and mythology around it, but at heart it's very dehumanizing, it's very
Oh yeah.
alienating. There are all these things that we ignore, and the left does it and the right does it, and it's because I think when you have a very specific agenda, that's
Hmm.
just the collateral damage. It's like, of course you're not actually, again, I think the biggest and most successful critiques of capitalism in the modern West and its kind of globalist system is that there's too much money invested in keeping problems rather than solving them. And
Hmm.
that this is probably the best, from communists and leftists and everyone else alike, this is the best critique I see. It's kind of like your postmodern thinkers, Foucault, Derrida, like, not, and especially, what's the other guy? Not Chomsky. I don't know, it doesn't matter, but that they made those observations, and like I said, the social media comes to mind, like, right, if any
Yeah.
of these companies cared about America or the future or the children, they would immediately make it so kids couldn't use social media. And why would they do that when kids are one of their hugest markets?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, to me, if there was a possibility for us to really work on values and morals in inner city communities, then that could change things, because ultimately what a person's mindset and beliefs hold will produce, their reality, in the sense that, if I've asked students before, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And one legitimately told me a McDonald's manager. And that was like, wow, like I want to be
Oh,
a
expand your
manager.
horizon. Yeah.
Yeah. And
or,
so
or
it's
was it, well, which side of it? Because yeah, it's like, well, at least they said manager, right,
right.
number
Yeah.
one, but also, again, expand your horizon.
Yeah, and that's what I think, that's where the controversy comes in, because the, like, I guess, woke morality police want to say, the second even like a black woman says, hey, you know what, in some of these communities there are morality and values problems, then I would get like beaten with a fly swatter for even saying that, because who am I, to dare critique somebody else's value systems or culture? And I mean, I think that's where
Well, then
things
how do you stand on one? If everything is relative, how do you stand on? See, this is what I think is part of the cultural morass. It's all a bait and switch. You can
yeah.
never hold anyone to like any kind of those people who actually think and operate like that. You can never hold them to the word. You can never get a straight answer. None of that shit, right? Sorry, pardon my French. It's just, and I think about this because, like, I told you about some of my friends who got into the consulting business, and it's like I texted one the other day, and he's like, I was just thinking about you. And it's like, I knew why. It's like, because here he is in this corporate meeting, putting up with this corporate bull crap that's selling utter bull crap, that's wasting the education system's time and money, and I'm not going to go that far. Maybe, I don't know what, to be fair, he didn't give me all the nitty gritty. He just kind of told me how corporate and cringe it was, I guess. And that it is the funniest thing that for all this talk about oppression and all these other problems, it's like, yet when it's the corporate and government slogan, something's not quite right here. When
Hmm. Oh,
everyone posts the same picture in their profile, when everyone says we're going to have a day of solidarity for that, and everyone gets in line, and then the next day, oh, now we're going to go to war with Ukraine, and we're in solidarity with that. Oh, and then I don't know if you've heard it amongst the kids, but the meme is quote unquote, I support the current thing.
yeah. No, I hadn't heard that.
Pretty good though, right? Like,
Yeah, it's funny.
yeah, don't. And then as they've also said, don't question, just don't think, just buy more product and be excited to buy more product after that. That's the whole mentality behind a lot of it. That whole relativizing kind of nothingness. It's like, again, I see it as an inevitable consequence, a byproduct, and also a reaction to this coming apart, this wider inevitable societal collapse.
Well, and I think the irony is that the people that are making these points about how everything is relative make that true for everything except for their own dogmatism. So,
Oh, right. Well, of course, because then you retain, and this is, dude, a lot of these postmodern people, like they criticize the West and our philosophy and our history and all that stuff, and you could say fair enough. But like, you have plenty of scientists and thinkers, like, a guy like Jung said, this is the problem with he acknowledged it's a problem with even like a whole field like psychology, is that through our own biases and selective kind of editing in our heads, that psychology gets to choose the questions it puts to nature, right? Isn't that convenient, right? Like, how do we know when we decide on an idea or go in that direction, we don't know what we're actually missing. We don't know what we don't see, right? We don't see those things until the failures or problems become evident, right?
Yeah.
And I just bring this up in context of, I guess this wider situation, like you saying that, of course that's convenient, and then that tells you that the whole thing is bad faith. There can be no trust. You can't actually talk to someone like that. I couldn't be friends with imagine trying to date someone like that. You would hate that. I wouldn't give my time a day like through that. But it reminds me of the bigger issue is that, for supposedly, I don't know at the end of the day what the real message is supposed to be from in our politics, because if it's also relativistic, and if you can dehumanize people so easily and then rationalize your dehumanization of them, and then, and it's like, look, I think women have been turned into the modern workhorse and men are largely disposable and dehumanized in their own way. Like, this is kind of the divide in the sexes as far as I see them, right? Like, I feel like women have been encouraged to sell their bodies and their minds, and men have basically been encouraged the same age old thing of like, well, you're disposable, you're mainly our soldiers, our worker bees, or you do these thankless jobs and no one's going to honor you or respect you for it. But this kind of goes back to me saying earlier, like, what these education systems are denying young men, because I think young men are suffering the most right now. Yes, I get it, young women are suffering a mental illness crisis never before seen witnessed, and part of that is the social media madness, and they share a lot of that pain and problems. But boys are just the invisible casualty in the meantime. And then the only time it's acceptable to give voice to it is in very channeled ways of, oh, you can care about a black man in prison, but don't care about someone, it all becomes obfuscation to me. Like, I don't know how it's not a distraction from the fact that men are dehumanized and disposable, period.
Yeah, and I think I really appreciate, Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach to so many things, because his emphasis really did go back to character, and how his dream was that his children were going to be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And the weird place that we're going is that character can't even be a discussion. Like, we're not allowed to say looting and burning down the local, hair weave store and like holding up signs and like kicking random people. Like, that's not moral. Like, that's not having character. That's not the right way to go about that.
You heard what they say, right? This ain't your granddaddy's civil rights movement.
Yeah. Yeah. And
or how about this? Liberals get the bullet too? There's a fun one.
Oh, no, I haven't heard. I don't think
you're not a liberal. You get the bullet anyway. You're self-admitted conservative. Look at you. You're just identifying yourself. Please, no, don't hurt me, right? I'll be whatever you want me to be.
For sure. Yeah. I guess technically I'd be independent, but I mean, that doesn't exist really in America. I guess you kind of have to pick a side.
No. Well, that's the hand that's been forced, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, I think that most people, and this is a side conversation, can kind of agree, like even formerly conservative Democrats, which I guess I probably would have been in that character or in that, category before things went insane.
No, it makes sense to me.
Yeah, it's crazy. But I think when it all comes down to it, like the giant, big, huge picture is that we need families. We need an agreed, set upon moral basis. We need character, we need values, and we need to agree. And since that's gone, I'm kind of beginning to wonder if like the hope for our Western civilization is gone, because essentially what's going to happen is my one of my close friends, she's the only happy teacher I've ever known, but she works in a homeschooling situation.
Oh, good.
Yeah, she works in a homeschooling co-op situation where She teaches the kids for 2 days a week, and then their parents teach them for the other 3 days a week. And, there's a shared set of values. The parents are taking on responsibility to teach the kids. Because I met with her a few weeks ago, and I was asking her, like, what does it feel like to not have all that burden on you to have the kids perform? And she said, oh, actually, there's zero burden on me. She said it's 100% the parents' responsibility to make sure the kids understand it. She said, I'm just the disseminator of information. Like, I am the dispenser of information, but it's the parents, responsibility to make sure that the students are doing the work and that they're understanding there's actually a partnership between parents and teachers, and they all have shared values. And I feel like going forward, that's going to be the only real option. I mean, if you're lucky, maybe you can find that in a private school community, or some kind of like homeschooling community. But I'm just thinking in terms of like public schools and just the way things are going politically, it's frightening and it's terrifying. And I guess I got out before a lot of the gender and pronoun stuff became a problem. But I've been hearing that some kids are wanting to be identified as cats or dogs, and they want to meow for their answers. I've heard that there's been problems in school because kids are wanting to change not only their pronouns, but their names every other week. And if kids mess it up, they're getting upset and saying, oh, there's like violence being done against me. And,
wow, I'm dude. And look, again, coming from your experience, coming from mine, it's just first world problems. Like what like we have the fruits of empire to appreciate. That Americans it's going down, that Americans can't even appreciate it. It's a bummer.
Yeah, and
it'd be one thing if this was happening and like people could show like a modicum of gratitude, or these kids like getting upset about the pronouns, going like, hey, like, look, these kids were killed for belonging to the wrong families because they live in the wrong country. You know what I mean? Their government hated them.
Yeah, and that's the point that I had to argue with surprisingly only a few people in my critical race theory. Most people were pretty supportive. It's
a funny thing, by the way, because I can never get a definition. I've never heard it actually defined. I've heard everyone dance around it and say it's real, it's not real, it's being taught, it's not being taught. But I'm still okay. Go on, sorry, and then I can question you.
It's purposely nebulous. But the thing that I really had kind of wanted to point out to some of the people in the comment section is that 2022, children and women, anybody you want to put in a disadvantaged category, have the best opportunity that they have had in American history. We've had a for all intents and purposes, black president, and that would have never happened.
It's almost like that. But here's the crazy thing. This is where things get Orwellian, regardless of that, like no one on the left seemed to like people loved him at the moment, but lots of people did not like him on the left and the right at the time. But it's, in terms of at least having one, it's almost like it never even happened.
Which thing never happened?
Like, it's almost like we never had a black president.
Yeah.
And then when people talk about it, it's usually cynical, and it's like, well, white people only voted for it because they felt guilty or whatever. And it's like, maybe some of them, sure. Like, but if you're going to talk about people feeling guilty, it's like clearly these white teachers and friggin' education feel guilty, and their mother complexes are getting in the way of educating the kids in a lot of cases. It's obvious.
Well, and the problem is we're never
they baby the kids, they coddle the kids, they don't punish. What was that?
Yeah, we're just never getting to the solution. That's the big problem. Because there is marketing on the idea that there's this problem and we're the commercial entity that's going to solve it for you.
The salesman is very Western, very idealistic, right? The salesmen are going to save the world once again. And it's like, we've heard this story. We've seen this story. Your very system brought itself to this collapse. Mm-hmm. And now you're what, selling race and pronouns is going to save it or fix it or help anybody? See, it's just the opportunity cost, the squander. It's baffling to know or to question how many generations of these kids have been crippled by the education system rather than helped by it. Because again, the stats are in and they're abysmal. The rates of illiteracy, I don't have them before me, but I've looked into them in the course of my education projects here. And again, I want to thank you for talking to me. We've been going here almost 2 hours, and we probably should start winding it down. Although I think there's at least a few more things I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
Go on.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think the biggest problem with all of this is that there's no solutions being presented. And I honestly think the solutions are incredibly simple. If we put all of our bajillion dollars towards some really simple solutions, it would be a lot better. But I think a lot of them is just the idea that we need to really work on kids in inner cities, morals and values.
Oh, and then content-based curriculum seems to be the best because you're building that. You're back to the notion of reading being so important because you're creating like a neural, like you're creating a network of your own conception and understanding of the world. And it's not just like, it's not for the sake of making simple, because so much of the politics is like so simplified as to be borderline retarding. And I don't mean that as a slur, right? I mean that is like it actually has a negative effect on the mind and the body, right? Like that it's taught to be so simplified, or it kind of heads in that direction versus going, no, these kids, the problem with these other kids in the first place is that they're already years behind these other kids who were taught to read at an early age, who were given lots of attention and reading, and who have already formed these complex networks of understanding and also networking with other people. Relationships are huge, right? Everything about us as social animals is regulated by our relationships and our feeling towards each other and the way we kind of both cooperate and compete. So again, if kids are lacking not just examples of competition and cooperation, but also conception and how to articulate that, whether that's sharing your thoughts or your feelings or exploring your thoughts and feelings, because, you know, I guess this is kind of the education has to have a teleology, right? It has to have that purpose. It has to have that center. It has to have that kind of, like you said, I guess even more like they said, that it does have to have a certain structure or aim and scaffolding, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that as long as I think I could just speak for the Black community, I think the entertainment is just abysmal and horrible. Like, you know, Nicki Minaj and Megan Thee Stallion. And
see, look, are you sure you're not just being old?
No,
you're being one of us old people. Because I hear you on plenty of it. It's like, look, I grew up on punk and heavy metal and rap too and plenty of other stuff, but you know, even then it's like, you know, I know decadence. I know it's actually, you know, I have an idea of like, hey, is this actually good for kids? A lot of it, not really, you know?
Well, and if you think about it, I mean, I'm going into really controversial waters here, but it's like, if that is your moral compass, is basically like, you know, sleep with an indefinite amount of men and maybe you abort the child.
Well, how else do women have value?
Yeah, right? It's terrible. And it's just like,
how else do women empower themselves? Apparently women's version, like this, a lot of these modern feminist versions of women empowering themselves is like trying to either ape men or dominate men, and it just it's laughable to me
too, because to me this goes back to the conspiracy. It's so ironic. In the olden days, women would talk about the problem of being objectified by men, and basically they would talk about the problem of pornography. And modern feminism is, we're going to become pornography to stick it to the man. Let me strip naked and protest about my liberation.
Right.
The guys are like,
yeah, you're not. Right. Yeah. I'm trying to remember how the song goes. There's a song that your excess isn't rebellion. You're buying what they're selling.
Ooh,
you know, your self-destruction doesn't hurt them. You know, talking about the system, and it's called how do you afford your rock and roll lifestyle, but it applies here. Absolutely. Going and then the actual damage that does in human relationships. You know, just not only to teach such cynical, hateful things between the genders and the sexes, and the races. But it, you know, if it's in the gender dynamic, you know, we're just barely getting into this here, but I know that that's a part of it too. And like it has a corollary in 1984 because, and I don't know if you remember Julia, I think in that book, I don't remember how she words it, but she says that a lot of the party, its politics, and the fact that it's based on rage and hatred is that part of it is predicated on sex going south, on the relationships being soured between the genders to the point that the state could come in and fully divide the genders and just make sure that they were in a constant state of unease and war, and that they had no love or appreciation of each other as human beings. And yeah, me, twisted.
Yeah, and that goes to for me the bigger conspiracy that I actually believe in.
Oh no, this is capitalism at its best, right?
People are joking about the idea that, you know, while we're arguing pronouns, Russia and China are gathering real military forces to come invade us, and it's like literally like a house divided against itself can't.
And it makes us look stupid. It is embarrassing. Look, yeah, you're an intelligent person. Like it's embarrassing to know. Is it because the embarrassment is secondary? It's more like, oh, this all has super serious consequences, and we're not talking about any of it. The president's not talking about any of it. They're sitting there saying, okay, back to Orwellian language, forever a recession defined as, an economic downturn for more than 2 quarters, right?
Mhm.
And like there it happened, and then everyone in the media, including the president and the vice president, no, this is not a recession. And it's like the same people in media. You can go back, check this out. You can go back a few months or years, and the same people are going, oh, this looks like a recession. We're 2 economic downturns. And then just again, a few years later, this is no longer the definition of recession. We've changed it. We'll call it something else then, or just don't gaslight us like this, right? It's insane. Uh,
Absolutely.
and then, okay, wait, but not to get distracted from the gender thing, because I think it's also important, that question of, okay, because I do question if this is how women are being taught to raise, and because men kind of do it naturally a little bit, but honestly, as men grow up and mature, any mature man who respects himself and who thinks of himself as, I don't know, in certain regards, I think generally they usually calm down with it. They usually calm down with it and wind up with a more stable life, usually because most men, just like I think a lot of most women, prefer a stable life rather than a crazy life, right?
Mhm.
Unless there's maybe something, again, wrong with them. So, and I mean that like specifically in terms of
Mental.
modern American dysfunction and mental illness, but like
Yeah.
I wonder how much that kind of that dehumanizing, no loyalty, no allegiance, no love for man and women, between man and women, I wonder how much that further degrades our ability to form lasting relationships, both sexually and as just friends.
Well, yeah, and then the children that are the product of those unions really get it the worst, and that those are the kids
Yes,
that are coming to school so broken because
right.
they haven't had their basic attachment needs met by sometimes either one of their parents, and it just is really it's really heartbreaking. And I think that the big root of the problem, kind of circling all the way back to the
Sure.
beginning of the conversation, is the loss of Judeo-Christian values. It's like family, marriage, taking care of your
Yeah, no, no,
children.
I think you're right. No, it's an age of nihilism. This is exactly, it's just, it was inevitable with that proverbial death of God. It wasn't just the death of, it means our organizing principles are going to fail, our values are going to fail, everything's going to come apart because we're no longer bound like we once were in a place and time. We are a
Mhm.
very different culture and people now.
And then pleasure
And
becomes God. And when pleasure and addiction is God, then the
yes,
result is a degradation and a falling apart of society altogether.
well, but see, in Brave New World, Mustafa Mann would say, no, don't you get it? This is the perfectly engineered society. We're no longer beholden to these values, heroism, values, loyalty. These have no place in an industrialized economic superpower whose whole purpose is consumption to the point of all but to the point of failure. Keep consuming, keep buying, keep the system moving because it needs to move. It can't stand still, it can't stop, but as much excess within the bounds of this kind of fake world we've created anyway.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think the end product is misery and
Yes.
depression
Yes.
and
Oh, it's suicide
suicide
too,
and
all of it.
mass murders, and because it's not a joyful way to live. The irony, and
No.
I
He is trying to point to those original values,
Mhm.
and he does question why they're there to begin with. And that's actually does line up with Nietzsche's conception going, here's the problem. The problem is we have these values. We don't even understand why we have them, but we live by them, and that they're going to fall apart, and we're still not going to be able to understand that, and we're not going to be able to put them back together again. This was Nietzsche's concern. I'm not going to say it's over and done for, but he understood that this would be a nihilistic age because after the disbelief in God, that all these things would come apart, and how would we ever come back together again? What's going to unite us now? And then you
totalitarian governments and
yes, yes. No, what do you call it? Digital dictatorships. Oh,
uh,
and then
metaverse.
yeah. And then
Yeah.
if you really take it to its logical conclusion, mankind seeking God in the machine,
Yeah.
this where it gets Brave New World in 1984 at its logical conclusion is that we're going to try to fully integrate ourselves with it and either create cyborgs or kind of and this is what the end look, I think a lot of this is kind of schizoid, far flung and far from reality, but there are very real elements that are very real possible. So my thoughts are, if a lot of these tech leaders and people are saying stuff like, to give you an example, he says, Harari, a foremost thinker who's influencing a lot of these like one world government globalist type of peoples. He kind of whispers in their ears.
A Bond
He
villain.
says, was that?
He's a Bond villain.
Yeah, kind of. And then he says that the way he sees it is that the human beings who are alive in 100, 200, a couple hundred years from now, they'll be as different from us as we are from chimpanzees or Neanderthals. And with most animals, when they reach that critical peak in evolution, that's a time of dying off, or that's a time of genocide, right? Like we outcompeted Neanderthals, they died off. We killed them. So if that's really where they're going, then it's kind of, and look, it's not even anything new. It would be the same old, same old. Oh, look, another genocide. We've seen this before. Now it's done under,
Yeah,
with.
I really believe it's going to happen. And that's where, well, yeah, and like fun fact, being Christian and believing in end times Bible prophecy, right? I mean, it's prophesied that there's going to be a one world government. There's going to be a mass genocide of anybody that does not go along with the system. There's a talk of the mark of the beast. A mark that everybody needs to buy or sell to be a part of.
I'm familiar with Revelations. Is the hell of a read, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's wild.
If you think that we'd be living in like a transhumanistic society with microchips and the metaverse and uploading consciousness.
Well, I'll say this. I think the immediate upset in global civilization and these ramifications we're going to be seeing, even despite the increasing the new industrial revolutions that are happening, and they're going to continue to happen. I think some of this, like this Great Reset stuff, Build Back Better stuff, like it's basically that was all a euphemism for a controlled burn. That's what they're talking about when they say that. Like whether people understand that or not, it's irrelevant. It's already happened. It's already done. They're milking the system for every last dollar because everyone feels it in their gut. We know that it might not be there tomorrow. That's the feeling, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
There's fear in the air. I know it. I know you know it. Everyone knows it.
Well, and it's kind of the order out of chaos, right? Or like never waste a crisis, or
Yeah. Oh, dude. And then and I've talked about this. I've talked about this a lot in the course of my work over the last year or so, and written about it too. That exactly. And then public health is always the excuse for tyranny, right? And you saw how quickly people got in line. Doesn't matter whether it's COVID or Ukraine, people just immediately line up. And see, this is why I said education is supposed to like not make us that way in theory, right? And again, it's like, okay, so it looks to me like we're educating people to be thoughtless, to be mindless, to be consumer drones, to be slaves, as a matter of fact, not to diminish that word. What was that?
Yeah, and to have no critical thinking skills.
And you talked about that. A lot of teachers did.
Yeah, that really surprised me a lot. Just some students' real difficulty and inability to like put two thoughts together and produce something coherent. It's a real struggle. It really is, because a lot of those skills are taught or they're modeled. And since we don't see people really debating anymore, and we don't really teach understanding and knowing both sides of the story and looking at the pros and cons of them.
You heard the comedian say it, right? That's how you win. You get the stupid on your side. That's what makes it easy. Is if think about it, if people are ignorant, if they don't know, they don't know anything about history, context, present mistakes, past failures, you name it. If they know nothing and have no historic or longer worldview, they're absolutely ripe for manipulation. I guess people like there's reason why people like that are always going to be called useful idiots.
Yeah, and it would be interesting to understand what happened in Nazi Germany, for the society to be able to be so controlled and go along with that.
There's a lot of good analyses out there, but because you could see a lot of different things at work: the social manipulation, the power of radio and media, telling everyone a story they want to hear, telling everyone, they got their heads are up their own asses, they love the smell of their own farts, right? America has gone that direction, yet it has no right to. Have you ever seen Idiocracy by chance?
I haven't. No, people bring it up all the time, but I haven't.
It's okay. So it might be a bit crude and whatever for your taste, but it's also quintessentially American, and there's even some prophecy in there. It's America in the future. The president is like he was a wrestler and a porn star. It's like really too close to home.
Really? Yeah, I think that we definitely, like you said, we're at a turning point in our country if we're not there already. But it's not looking good for people that don't agree, essentially. And I think people are going to really have to start thinking that have kids, what they're going to do about public school, or how
Excuse
they
me.
have to go to public school, how they're going to counteract
Right, but
the
serious
effects
question.
of public
What
school.
side of the bars do you want to live on? Do you
Mhm.
take the mark or do you not take the mark? You
Yeah,
know?
yeah, and
Look, look, I'll admit it. I'm not a Christian. I wouldn't take the mark.
good. I think people have to really figure out, if we don't really have a whole lot of hope for the public education system, for
Right.
example, and for where society is going, I think small communities are just going to start forming where
It's
people
just,
say
yeah,
we
it's
can
going to be the
advance
only
these values.
realistic answer, right? Because what
Yeah,
else do you have? There's nothing. Like, if there's no cohesion, if there's no real we, if you don't like what your city, your county, your state, your school boards are doing, it's like there's not much you can do but kind of seek that out and seek to create a community and a network of your own. And I think this is a lot of the modern disconnect, is people don't have those networks. And a lot of people, they never learn how to network with others. And it's very important, both in real time, in real life, if you will, and online.
yeah, and I think parenting is more important than ever. And I've been really annoyed. Sometimes I go to my newsfeed in Google, and so I'm getting like these TikTok videos of moms bragging that my kids have unlimited screen time. I let my daughter wear a thong to a beach. This is literally the article I was reading yesterday. And they're getting like, hundreds of thousands
How
of
old
likes.
was the daughter?
Well, this was like a young mom. I'm not sure how old the daughter was, though. Maybe she was an older
Well, you
teen.
said thong to the beach.
To the beach, yeah.
So, because
Um,
I mean, thongs cover like nothing. Oh, like
Nothing.
it's like almost nothing to the imagination. Like it's like a little,
Right.
like a dental floss.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean they're getting all of
See,
this.
where's dad? Look, maybe to be an old curmudgeon. Like, where's dad to put a blanket on that girl? Like, what the
I'm
hell?
telling you. Yeah, probably there isn't one. And so I think that there needs to be a parenting
Yeah, she wants to
revolution.
be. She wants to be friends, right? She wants to be friends with
Yeah.
her daughter. Like you see that. I know you guys have that problem in education, that you have a lot of these parents who, again, they haven't been parents to their kids. Now we're getting back into the morass, and I think I had a long list of questions we never even got around to, but I think we covered them in a roundabout way, very much so. From the consulting stuff to who's responsible for, and it just seems, honestly, it seems like a hydra. Like, it just kind of seems like a hydra. It's got all
Mhm.
these heads, and you don't even know, like, it doesn't matter if you cut one off, it's like it'll get three more. It's like, okay, we got rid of I don't know, No Child Left Behind, and here's CRT, and would you call the
Yeah.
other thing BEMA, and
Oh,
um
BIST.
BISC, yeah, and all that, that.
Yeah, I think it's got, people really have to decide what are our values, what are our morals, and they have to like really, really
Oh,
teach that to their kids.
yeah, and it's like, dude, and it comes down to, I think it really is that it's like, do we actually value humanity or not? Do we value flesh or not? And then do our actions in the world reflect that? And I guess the question for modern industrial civilization, it's like, well, when everything's so diffuse and it's hard to be responsible for yourself because everything is diffused, like the government's happy to take up the power, the state's happy to take up the power, no one wants to be responsible, no, everyone thinks we have an entitled consumer mindset. So it's like, and I don't know that, is it just otherwise too idealistic to expect anything else? Was this just the inevitability that we would lose our values to the most shallow kind of pragmatism of, well, look, we can be hedonic, we can meet our needs. If you guys want to have values, you can go live in the dirt over there. Us over here, we're in like Babylon 2.0. We're in Sodom and Gomorrah 2.0, right? Like Manifest Destiny 2.0, right? You're either on our side or you're in the way. It
Yeah,
is spooky.
I think to a degree, because of human brokenness, there's always going to be injustice. People are always going to like do the wrong thing. But my bias is that to the degree that, people would hold to Judeo-Christian values, which if you really look at a lot of the people that did prison reform, that did ed reform in the olden days back in Europe, they were actually Christians that were like, hey, these hospital conditions are awful. We need to have more dignity for
Oh,
people
it's the
in
same thing with
prison.
a lot of them here too in America. Are more, and they were less idealistic. Like, I can't remember. I think it was Eugene Debs or one of these older American socialists from some other era that's long gone, right? But he's the kind of guy who'd say something like, it's all well and good to care about the poor and the downtrodden and all that stuff. He's like, but know that they're often mean, nasty, unintelligent, vile people with their own motives and their own hatreds and their own ignorances, and they're
That's
not,
true.
to sit there and pity them, it does them no friggin' good. And like, this is a problem. This is a beef I have with a lot of not going to say just Christians, but a lot of, it's the same problem with liberals too, right? The bleeding heart, the bleeding heart liberals, just kind of the more modern secular Christian. That's what they are, right? It's what their morality is. They didn't create their morality. They borrowed it from Judeo-Christianity, and to the degrees that they've kind of altered it in their minds or tampered with it, is like, I think they want the kingdom without God in it. And maybe that's a good way of putting it.
That'll preach, brother.
Yeah, look, I mean, yeah, I'm sure. I mean, look, like I told you, I'm not a Christian, but I wouldn't doubt if a preacher said that.
You nailed it. No, that's really what it is. And going back to your question of like, can any society or culture really do this? I mean, to the degree that they say we don't believe in God, there's no basis anymore. If there's no judge that is judging.
No, good point. No. And as a philosopher is a judge, a wise man, a wise woman, an experienced man, an experienced woman, we learn to be judges. We judge ourselves and we judge others. And it's okay to judge yourself, and it's okay to even have, I think what we're missing is, I guess this is Nietzsche's criticism of modern people, that they lack the ability to hate themselves, to despise themselves, to realize how small and weak they really are, and in the any sense of overcoming that or doing anything more or better, not to get too philosophical on you, but
no, I totally,
it's standards. It's standards, it's values, it's judgments. I did appreciate some of those Thomas Sowell clips in the education special where he was talking about we're expected to be non-judgmental, and I couldn't help but laugh every time I heard Sowell say, do not expect sound judgment from a society that has no standards.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and no, and I think, and I guess, look, because I get it with podcasts, a lot of times people don't want to leave people on a bad note or on a negative note. But my thoughts are, if the lesson is clear, it's like, look, for anyone who can listen and understand this, don't expect anyone else, least of all the state, least of all the teachers, least of all anyone outside your family, your networks, the people you value and love and care about, and who have proven that you guys trust and love it, right? Like, outside of that, like, dude, don't put your hope in any of these things. Don't expect that. Like, you got nothing coming to you, And I'm just trying to frame this and, to end on a better note than, well, we're screwed, because I could say that too, because I think that's kind of inevitable. And I'm happy as a fatalist. Like, I got no qualms here,
Yeah, it comes back to what do people want out of life? For a lot of people, it's positive relationships, maybe a family, maybe a community, to be able to live with their own conscience, that they're doing their best to be kind to others and to benefit humanity in some sense or another.
And to build what they want to build and to engage their creativity, right? Whatever it is that drives people.
Yeah.
Go on. And
just for a lot of people, a lot of teachers, we really hope to do our good in the world by helping kids.
Right. But the results are in. I'll just sum it up for everyone else real quick. Is that essentially, for everyone who's been listening, basically teachers kind of like, they can't do their job. They're blamed for everything. They're seen as the problem. They're kind of the go-between. They are the governmental worker who's bearing the brunt of our societal crisis. They are one of those kind of places where so many worlds collide, right? Students, parents, government, policies, right? And that you guys have been bearing that brunt because of all these problems.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the best thing that, teachers that can continue to do is to like speak the truth to the ability that they can. If parents want to help, they can really ask questions of school boards. Right. I always advocate kindness and not like the screaming nutcase people.
Oh, dude, yeah. I honestly, the screaming person, I don't think they'd be listening us to understand anyway, right? But, in the off chance that one of them winds up here.
Yeah, just like kindness and really a parenting revolution of choosing the values that you believe in and really doing your best to like instill those in your kids and talk to your kids if they go to public.
And it's hard. I get why people don't want to do it. It's hard to instill your values, and it makes it harder for your kid, because your kid then has to reconcile the values he's taught with the values he sees in this world. Yes. He or she, right? Like that. So, okay, imagine you're a young girl and your parents trying to teach you about the importance of chastity. It's like, you don't understand. You don't even by 15, you don't understand the true dangers and commitment of sex and parenthood, right? Like, kids, people, modern Americans are still kids at 15, men and women alike, right? So it's like, it really does, to be a value. I guess that's the whole thing, right? Values and to judge is in its own right is to set the house at odds.
Yeah, and it's going to be sacrificial. You won't get praised in public. You might. Oh,
yeah. We get praised or blamed anyway, right? So why let to my mind, why let anyone or anything stop you? That we're not really seen or understood. We're largely just praised or blamed. Someone sees your video, it's like they're not going to appreciate your 8+ years of teaching. They're not going to appreciate all you went through. They're just going to hear you saying one opinion you didn't like, and all of a sudden you're the devil to them. It's insane, right?
Oh,
It's
yeah.
absolutely pathological.
Absolutely.
And and I'll say this, it's been, I appreciate you coming on here, and I appreciate you talking about these things, because I get it. It's not pretty, and and I appreciate you
And
taking
people
the
don't
time.
want a mirror held up. I had somebody
No, they don't.
comment on one of my first videos, like, this is all depressing. Like, why would anybody ever want to be a teacher? Where's the positive stuff? And I just wrote to her kindly. I said, there's a reason why half of all teachers are quitting within the first 5 years, and somebody needs to talk about it. And my audience is either people that care about teachers, or teachers that have felt frustrated and hurt by the system, but they feel like they don't have an outlet or a voice. And so I just nicely wrote to her, if this is uncomfortable for you, then you're not the intended audience that I'm trying to reach here.
Right. And then again, sorry that you had a minor bit of discomfort on the internet, which you could have completely ignored or bypassed anyway. Like, it's just, again, first world problems. And it's like, if the first world is falling apart, then that's all our problem. But that, again, this reminds me of the whole, like, what would you call it? Like you say, fiddling while Rome burns, or what was the term you used earlier?
Oh, reorganizing deck chairs
on the Titanic. Yes, yes. It's like, okay. Well, tell you what, Trish, change everything so you can accommodate this one random person. Okay, like, I get it. You don't have to be mean to it, but like you said, you promote kindness and humanity, and I appreciate a mature humaneness, right? One that any kind of mature humaneness I can appreciate, especially if it's I just because I know it's generally not, like, it's just not how we are. It's actually, you have to mold yourself. You have to shape yourself to be that way, right? Values aren't just a given. They have to be built. They have to be maintained. They have to be dusted off from time to time and really looked at.
Definitely. Well, this is
yeah, no, and look, and I could go on, but originally I was thinking, like, look, well, we'll just do a good hour, maybe, but we just kind of carried on, and here we are, we're almost at 2 hours. But before we go, again, this has been Every Trivial Fact. My name is Me As No One, your host. This has been my friend Trish, Teacher Therapy on YouTube. You can find my stuff here on my YouTube channel, my website, bezabezar.com. That's BEZABEZAR.com. And as for you, Trish, you got channel and some stuff you'd like to promote?
Yeah, just teacher therapy, and I'm trying to get all the audios from the videos on a podcast. I have a teacher therapy podcast on Spotify too, and my dream would be to write a book, but we'll see if that happens or not.
Sure, if and when you do, I'd love to talk to you again, and from here I'll just say we'll talk to you sometime in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me.
Hey, thanks for being here, and you're welcome.
Bye-bye.